All right, good. So I will open the January 25th meeting of the Hamilton Planning Board and take roll call, starting with Jonathan.
Jonathan Poor here.
Bill.
Bill Wheaton here.
Ori.
Corey Beaulieu, present.
Emil.
Emil Dahlquist here.
Pat.
Pat Norton, present.
Marnie.
Marnie Crouch here.
And Rick Mitchell here.
So and you got me. You forgot.
Oh, I'm sorry, Richard.
Yeah, thank you. I forgot about it. I'm sorry. Apologize. Thank you for calling, Patrick.
And Richard.
Here.
You're here.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll open the meeting. On the agenda tonight primarily is Chabaco Woods 133 Essex Street special permit hearing continued. And then board business, if we have any time and energy afterward. So with that, we'll open it up. I will say that we have a lot of detailed information. And I know the applicant has a lot to present. The member of the board has asked to make a presentation, as well as the public and the representatives and consultants of Chabaco Woods. So we're likely to go over the half-hour increments, but I'd ask people to be very direct, concise, succinct in their presentations, and focus on the issues at hand and the specific topics so that we can use our time efficiently. So, Jill, why don't you go ahead? We're going to be talking tonight about blasting plan, the site hydrology, and the site geohydrology. One thing in your presentation, Jill, for both the board and the public, we have multiple consulting firms reviewing the hydrology and geohydrology. So I think it would be helpful in your presentation to identify whether they're peer reviews, your responses are in response to peer review, whose consultant is what, because we've got multiple consulting comments here.
Sure, absolutely. I can actually I can put it down in my list. So if I may, I'm actually going to ask that some members of the public be promoted, and basically in order to allow them to speak easily. If I may, I'm going to ask to share my screen, because what I did was actually create a list of all the people so that the board would immediately be able to see the people that maybe they should direct a question to. So if I may share, Mr. Mitchell?
Go ahead. Do you have access to sharing?
Not yet.
Patrick, is that your
Megan is taking care of it as we speak.
No worries. Thank you. Here we go. Thank you very much, Patrick. So just to begin, can you see my screen yet? Sometimes it takes a little bit of time.
No,
okay, wonderful. So for this evening's presentation, we have very much tailored our list to basically focus on blasting. So what you're looking at right now is just a list of the people that are here on behalf of the village at Chabaco Hill. So petitioner, as everybody knows, is Larry Smith and Julia Dickinson. I believe that Mr. Smith may have been promoted. It would be a good idea if we could promote him to a panelist. I am Land Use Counsel, Jill Elmstrom-Mann. The civil engineer, who is also in attendance as a, I think he's a panelist. No, he may not be a panelist. He's probably just a participant, is Brent Cole and Jeff Merritt from Granite Engineering. We have our blasting company principal here in attendance, Andy DeFore from Maine Blast Drilling and Blast. We have our geohydrologist. So we actually hired a firm to review the control blast plan from main drilling and blast, as well as to review the hydrology of the site. And though that technical consultant is Geotechnical Engineers, or GEI, and it's James Christensen and Rick Frappa, and it may again not be a bad idea to I'm going to try and reduce this so that you can see it better, so that we can actually talk to both James and Rick about the plan, as well as Andy Dufour. Our landscape architect is in attendance, and you'll see why. I'm going to relate back to the blast plan. And then the town's peer reviewer, because you asked me to do so, is GZA, and the person in attendance from that firm I had seen was in the panelist, and that's James Emery. So what I thought would be important is to just give you one full understanding of the fact that blasting is not an uncommon occurrence. It is a fairly standard method of construction, and for many sites over time, blasting has been used in order to develop land. I offered the screen attached that you see just to show you how frequent there are actual blast events, not only in the town of Hamilton, but also in the town of Wenham, in an area located very, very close to this particular site. This was basically something that you had a presentation from your fire department and the chief. And he basically went through the fact that it is fairly common for there to be blasting permits. There is only really record evidence of blasting since 2001, because that's when the real permitting process came in. However, based on conversations with the chief, as well as just visualizing many, many sites around Hamilton, there's many instances of blasting all throughout this area. I will note that a substantial number of the blast sites are actually in the GPOD, while our site is not, and our blast zone is not. Many of the areas you see in Chabaco area known blast events, there's a substantial number of those that are actually in the GPOD, and I know the board knows what they are, because you can see that it's around and surrounds Chabaco Lake as well as Beck Pond. So I offer that just for clarification and or to support what information you were presented by the fire department. Next, what I wanted to present, and there was some, I find it a little surprising. At the last hearing, somebody had said we hadn't given a cut and fill analysis, but in fact, that cut and fill analysis has been distributed previously and is actually shown in the upper quadrant. You can see it in the green and blue. Our original proposal was to actually have the units structured and the development structured as shown, with units adjacent to and proximate to Chabaco Road. So we developed this cut and fill plan, and we showed you what the actual cuts and or fills would be, and that was included in the blast plan and has been distributed previously to the board and has been available for the public to view. However, based on commentary, welcomed commentary from this board, we actually greatly revised the plan, but I still had distributed, and Mr. Wheaton had asked for this, copy of this plan that you see in the right-hand quadrant of your screen, which shows what the actual development areas would be and where there would be impact and or disturbance. And this is showing you that a substantial portion of the site remains untouched. I mean, you can see it, the forest land, etc. And also, I offer simply for the sake of showing you, if a conventional plan with a conventional roadway were to go in, the exact blast site would be the same. There would be absolutely no change in how we would have to come in, and you can see that by virtue of just looking at the below plan. I don't offer it for any reason other than to demonstrate that the by right use of this particular project would entail more blasting than we actually are proposing and less control, because this is a special permit. Now I wanted to go through the changes. So based on many comments we received from this board, and I'd like to thank, the board members. It was Mr. Wheaton, it was Mr. Poor, it was Mr. Doug, it was all of you, every one of you had, comments because you were concerned about the proximity of our development to Chabaco Road. As a direct result of that, our engineering team went back and actually revisited the plan and re-identified how, in fact, we would develop the site. As a result of that, we were able to create several small and medium-sized units, which was something the board had actually asked us to do. And we also created in excess of 250 feet from the central line of Trabaco for the first unit. And we are working on that artist illustration. I do not offer it tonight simply because I did want to focus on the blasting plan, but we will have that for you at the next meeting. And I can assure you that what you see is minimal in comparison to what the prior viewscape was, and you can see it clearly from here. I will say that I had offered what the cut and fill plan is in the top right-hand corner, because we actually were able to reduce the amount of cut by 20,000 cubic yards by having eliminated those first couple of units. So that was a tremendous impact by actually eliminating those units. Obviously, we still need to have some blasting in this area in order to get into the site. However, we were able to cut that back tremendously. I just offered the landscape plan to show you how, in fact, we're preserving in this area. Now I just popped forward 1 second. How we're preserving the ledge face in this area, which is what we are no longer blasting, which was very important to many members of this board. Now I'm going to go to the next page, which is the one that shows the updated aerial plan. And again, I offer this because you can see that we've eliminated many of the cuts at the top of the plan and actually have reforested areas at the top. So the reason why this plan is substantially different from the last plan that you had seen is because the areas that are going to be disturbed, that will then not be, if you will, replanted and allowed to go back to their natural state, are only those areas shown in this olive green. The areas you see in the dark green, we are replanting and they will be left undisturbed. And that includes these areas. This is a rain garden, but the rain garden will be planted even with woody growth. And when you look back at the other plan, you can see that it actually will have large river birch in them. And again, these areas as well. And by having done this and try to be very surgical and precise in the blasting, we were able to, again, minimize how much blasting we would have at the site at the direction of this board. I will say that we did in fact review, I'm going to come out of this now, stop my share. We did in fact review our blast plan that we had submitted to this board. Obviously, the board we had a blast plan. We developed it with main drilling, and Andy DeFore will go over that with you. But when we developed that blast plan, we wanted to ensure that if there was any additional measures that could be taken, we hired a hydrogeologist that could tell us what those things needed to be. As a result of that, we hired GEI, Mr. Frapper and Mr. Christensen, to review those plans, to look at the site, to tell us what we could do to monitor the site during our blasting events, what we could do to test surrounding properties to ensure that the blasting plan did not affect personal property and or the hydrology. Relative to stormwater, we also provided the board with a full stormwater report that protects the property from erosion, sedimentation, and changes in the watersheds. We protected against that, and we've complied with all of the conditions, I should say not even conditions, but the rules and regulations of the Massachusetts DEP. And this board's peer reviewer actually confirmed that we did do that. So basically, we took our plan, GEI reviewed it, which they will discuss with you this evening, and then we understand that the board wanted to ensure that those plans, because it was our reviewer who went through, that you got a third-party independent review that actually reviewed the plan in terms of, is there any property damage or any property that will be at risk as a result of our control blast plan? Is there any water resources that are going to be at risk as a result of our blast plan? And we got confirmation from the town's peer reviewer, confirmed the research in the conclusion reached by GEI that in fact, number one, there will be no damage to property, that we will put in place seismic readers that will review any kind of vibration. And to the extent there is some sort of an outlying event, which is unexpected, Then we will have in place certain measures to control that, to analyze that, and to respond immediately to that. And that goes for water quality, that goes for personal property, and that goes for the surrounding areas and any kind of resources that are in this particular area. And at this point, I think I'm trying to go fast so that the board doesn't get a lot of just me talking. I wanted the board to also hear from Mr. DeFore relative to the controlled blast plan, because I recognize that that has been, repeatedly spoken about, not only by board members, but by abutters as being some, unusual or environmentally insensitive process. And I would like Mr. DeFore to speak to that. And then we will have Mr. Frapp and Mr. Christensen as well. And then this board could obviously ask its peer reviewer to confirm the conclusions that are reached by the principal or the petitioners, representatives and agents. Andy, are you, oh, there you are, I see you now. If you can unmute yourself and then just address the board.
Yes, they let me in, Jill. So, good evening, everyone. As Jill said, my name is Andy Dufour. I do work for Main Drilling and Blasting. So I was in front of the board, so it was a while back, so I think I gave my introduction speech then, but I'll just go over it briefly again for anybody who doesn't remember, just as a refresher. But I'm in charge of the operations in Massachusetts for Main Drilling and Blasting. We are a company that was founded going on our 56th year in Gardner, Maine, and that's why it's named Main Drilling and Blasting. But we do have a local presence. We have our local office in Milford, Mass. We have offices pretty much all down the eastern coast, Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Tennessee. So we're well established, and we're we understand what it takes to do a project like this in such a sensitive area without causing damage to either structures, houses, or the environment. So I compiled this blast plan that's been discussed. So we typically do these for projects such as this. And a lot of times we'll focus in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on CMR1. So you guys have heard from the chief. I think everybody understands how regulated we are at this point. So I don't think we need to go over that in any further detail. But if you look at the blast plan and what's covered, a lot of it focuses on the code because we are heavily regulated. And the code is basically designed to protect structures within the area. It doesn't touch a lot on the environment. And we know this project is highly sensitive with the environment and the hydrology. So what we did here versus a typical blast plan is we focused on that. We made sure the product selection we're going to use, it's not going to be detrimental to the environment, meaning it doesn't pertain perchlorates or free-flowing ANFO, which is ammonium nitrate fuel oil. We also focused on well testing in the plan, which is something that the state code does not require, but we've said we're going to test all the wells within the vicinity. The plan also goes on to talk about pre-blast surveys. Several of those will be offered. We talk about monitoring, so seismograph monitoring. So we will put out seismographs in the neighborhood at neighboring structures to measure our vibration and air overpressure that the blasting would create. The state has regulations, they have limits for these, and we need to ensure that we stay below those limits. And all of our blasts are designed to do that. And I'm sure as you heard from the chief, there would be a fire detail on site monitoring those readings for every day we're there blasting. The blast plan also talks about the sequencing of the job, our hours of operation, how we control the movement of the rock. It talks about site security, ensuring nobody's in the blast zone when we go to blast. Our warning signs and signals. Also the blaster qualification and training. So everybody in the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has to have a certificate of competency in blasting in order to do this work. And that is their license. It's not Main Drilling and Blasting's license. It's personally tied to them. So they need to follow the regulations to ensure their livelihood. We talk about the safe limits, which we mentioned a little bit earlier. The licensing, permits, and insurance. So we do have insurance. We are a blasting company, and that's always discussed, and we are insured. And then environmental considerations. And part of that is the explosive selection, like we discussed. And then we talk about the design of the blast itself and how we're going to design the blast to control the charge weight, to control the vibration at the adjacent structures to prevent any damage. And that's pretty much the high points. I think this has been distributed and reviewed again. So I'm here to answer any questions. And I think with that, Joe, we could move on.
Perfect. I appreciate it. So in summary, Andy is here to answer any questions that this board may have relative to the blast plan and the protocols put in place to control the events. And again, we do have James Christensen and Rick Frappa here who will address, what those impacts are. So you heard Andy DeFore speak to the chemical component. I think that let's talk about a property first. So, and I'll ask GEI to weigh in on this. So as you heard Mr. DeFore say, the plan has been designed to control blasting in order to ensure that properties are not damaged. And basically, we had GEI review that plan and agree that those methodologies relative to the amount of charge, the amount of vibration were sufficient to control the blasting such that there would not be damage to personal property. And on January 4th, the town's peer review consultant concurred that the plans put in place, the controls being used, were actually sufficient to protect personal property, and that plan was sufficient and appropriate. At this point, I would ask GEI just to kind of briefly provide its conclusion so that the board hears from a technical consultant relative to the personal property aspect. And then potentially, if the board would want this to happen, we could ask Mr. Emery from GZA to concur and explain. So at this point, I would turn it over to GEI relative to the plan in protection of personal property.
Now, Jill, before that happens, we just want to be clear that this was an independent review
Yes.
consultant that you hired
Yes.
to do an independent review.
Yes, so GEI is the independent consultant that the petitioner hired in order to review Mr. DeFore's plan, because we wanted to have someone outside of the contractor who would be doing the work.
Yep. Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a quick footnote. I did want to mention that James Emery is here from Goldberg Zoino Associates. They are a sub-consultant to TEC, who is the primary consultant, peer review consultant for the town. So as the chair had mentioned and Jill had as well, the proponents consultants will do their review, and then after that's completed, Mr. Emery will provide his comments and review.
So at this point, if Mr. Christensen and Mr. Frapper, if you could just weigh in on that personal property and real property protection, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure, Jill. Thank you all to Planning Board for inviting us tonight. My name is James Christensen. I'm a geotechnical engineer with GEI Consultants. And our firm has been working with main drilling and blasting for many, many years on many projects across New England and, further beyond. And in my experience, we have not had any problems with main drilling and blasting, but I will walk you through the process that is undertaken on a typical blast project like this. You've seen the blast plan that's been submitted so far. What will happen will be a test blast program. And in a test blast program, the blaster will design a specific charge, to be detonated, and seismographs will be located at distances away from that charge to measure the site-specific behavior and how those vibrations travel through this site. And the reason we do that is to be able to predict the vibrations that will occur at the adjacent structures, at the nearest structures. And as Andy mentioned before, it's state law. It's law in the Commonwealth to conform to specific vibration criteria and overpressure criteria. And the monitoring program will be put in place not only during the test blast program, but there will be monitoring during production blasting throughout the process to check that the vibration levels are meeting the standards, are meeting the requirements to be protective to abutters and adjacent properties and structures. So I don't want to get into the real details and the nitty gritty of blast monitoring, but I can speak from a geotechnical engineering standpoint that the measures that are described in the blast plan absolutely meet industry standard and are intended to be protective to structures and property around the site.
Perfect, thank you. And then I think at this point, this is pretty the if you will, faster presentation. If perhaps Mr. Emery, for the benefit of the board, you know, in your January 4th letter, and we'll go back to the other portion of your opinion, but relative simply now to the personal property aspects and the method in which we're going to monitor, survey, and then you know, avoid personal property damage. If you could just inform the board of your opinion, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you. And thank the board for inviting me to to this meeting. So just a little background. I'm a senior hydrogeologist, former president of Emery and Garrett Groundwater Investigations, which is now a division of GZA. We are engaged in a lot of groundwater investigations as they relate to adverse impacts associated with various activities, development, blasting, and so forth. And I will say from the start that my opinion about Maine Drilling and Blasting Inc. is their gold standard for doing blasting the right way. We have been involved with a number of projects, always on the opposite side of the coin, seemingly, but with the utmost concern about making sure that local communities are not impaired or adversely impacted by blasting activities. And one of the most recent one was the Premium Outlet Mall project, which is the largest blasting program in the state of New Hampshire for that period of time, which was upgrading of a municipal water supply. So clearly there were a lot of issues that had to be worked through and resolved. And in that particular environment, that worked very well, and we were able to coordinate a activity plan that not only could work from a private standpoint, but also protect the public. So I just want to let you be aware that the company that's being charged to do this work is what I consider to be probably the best group in New England to be able to do this. So that's not to say that mistakes can't be made, but that's the background. I did review the GEI work, and we felt that we came to a very good common ground. We were charged, or I was charged with looking at the potential to cause adverse impacts to water quality to the local groundwater community, those that use domestic wells and residential wells. Would we lower water levels and reduce the yields of those wells? And could we possibly impact the water quality? The review of of the work that was done resulted in our recommendation of a number of things. One was to conduct a fractured bedrock site review, characterization study to assess what fractures already exist in fault systems and discontinuities that might present pathways for the migration of on-site chemicals and or groundwater. We also recommended, and they had agreed to, using the compound called Blastex. Andy had referred to it a little bit. They're going to move away from ANFO and perchlorate laden explosives, which is a very great start to assure that contamination of offsite wells is not going to occur because they're using the right product. We recommended that the blasted rock should be processed and removed within 72 hours of blasting, and that the rock that is blasted would be covered with an impermeable cover to prevent any rainfall from causing infiltration of residue, blasting residue onto the ground and into the ground. We also recommended that that material that's not taken off site that be used under the existing facility, so it would be covered by the actual construction. We did ask that the town and the blaster come to terms with a website for predicting rainfall, and that blasting would not occur during a period of rain or precipitation when more than 1/10 of an inch of rain would be predicted. And that has been agreed to in terms of how, when blasting would occur, and to avoid any type of rainfall on top of the blasted rock. We recommended that additional 3 monitoring wells be installed. They had recommended 5, and we had recommended 3 additional ones. They have agreed to those 3 additional wells, so now we're talking about 8 monitoring wells. And we've located that in our document that we submitted to the town on January 3rd. We also recommended groundwater quality monitoring, both on-site and off-site. And one of the things that we agreed to just recently is that there, as Andy indicated, there's no requirement for monitoring of domestic wells and residential wells per se, but the applicant has agreed to monitor or do an inventory of all wells within 1,000 feet of the blast area. And for those homeowners that are accepting to allow monitoring both from the water quality and the water level, that water level monitoring would be occurring with automated equipment, would collect water level data every 30 minutes. It would start 30 days before the blasting started, continue on during the blasting, and 30 days after blasting was terminated. That record would be available to the homeowner and to the town for each individual homeowner's well that's been, has allowed that equipment to be installed. I did indicate that the scheduling of transformation of information would be something that the board could determine and establish at some point down the road. But my recommendation would be that there'd be a sharing of data, every 2 weeks or so. The water quality monitoring is established with a series of parameters that GEI had put together, we agreed with, and essentially have agreed that that sampling will be occurring every 2 weeks on site and off site. And again, that data would be made available and transparent to the town and to the landowner as needed. And then we also recommended that post-blast monitoring be done, and GEI actually increased that from our recommendation, so they went beyond our recommendation. We've asked that water quality sampling be done for a full EPA suite of drinking water assessments 2 weeks after the blasting is done and a year after the blasting is completed. And so I might tip my hat off to GEI and their consultant for understanding and agreeing to the post-blast monitoring of water quality. And then lastly, we had requested a mitigation plan be put together that would be a spill prevention mitigation, so that any activities on site, there would be an action plan should any kind of spill of fuel or other material, that they would address that instantaneously. And I think the bottom line is that, as Jill has mentioned, this blasting occurs throughout, New England, of course, and it's common practice. And the key will be to do this in a way that's not going to generate any kind of adverse impact to the local community and the groundwater quality as well. And so these measures are put in place: monitoring wells, monitoring of offsite wells, both quality and water level, such that that data can be, it's current, it's reviewed, and if there were to be any type of adverse or suspected problem that would be noticed by the monitoring program, we have adequate time to modify that blasting program so that permanent damage does not occur. So I believe that the monitoring program is key to this process. I believe that the work that the applicant has done has been very good. We have made 8 or 9 recommendations. They have accepted all those recommendations and have agreed to carry those out. I mean, those will have to be put into writing at some point. But it all takes everybody's good efforts to make this work. And I think you start off with the right contractor, you start off with the right process, you start off with the right blasting agent, and we have a good foundation, I think, for the town of Hamilton to succeed in this particular initiative. So with that said, that's essentially all I have to weigh in at this moment.
Thank you so much. So at this point, Mr. Mitchell, you know, our representative whose work was reviewed by Mr. Emery, which was Rick Frapper as well as James Christensen, I think maybe they could give additional support and basically say almost identical to what Mr. Emery said relative to the fact that the plan put in place is intended to protect groundwater, and you know that the system in place is actually a protection to the environment, and we aren't going to otherwise negatively impact the environment. But I don't know, would Mr. Mitchell, would you like to hear from Mr. Frappa again, or would you prefer that he wait and then respond directly to comments from the board members?
Yes. Yeah, I think you've got to, you've laid a good groundwork. And so I would ask if board members have specific questions. This would be the time to ask them, because we have various consultants and firms that will be involved in the process.
I don't really have quite a sense of the scale of this operation. So if I asked one of the consultants, or all of them, how many blast events will occur over what length of time? I realize this is not something you can predict exactly, because as you develop, you'll go along and make changes. But, you know, are we talking about 10, 20, 100 blast events? Are we talking about 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 months, 2 years? Just so we have an idea how long and how extensive this will be.
We absolutely have an answer for you. It will be a process that's being undertaken in 2 phases. Mr. DeFore will speak to it, but we have 2 phases of blasting. The first phase is to get in to the development, to construct that roadway coming in. That's Mr. DeFore. I think it would be best to hear from you, because you are the technical expert relative to this. So if you wouldn't mind speaking as to both phases.
Yep, sure. So as Jill stated, they've broken the project up into 2 phases. The first phase, just open the information. We expect 81 days of blasting. Now that's not calendar days, that's work days. So 81 days, and that is to blast 162,000 cubic yards of rock. When that is complete and phase 2 starts, we're looking at an additional 26 days for 26,000 cubic yards of rock. So it's 26 blast days again, not calendar days. So.
And I will note that that was actually, was that based on the prior blast plan or the?
No, this is updated, Jill,
Yes.
as of January, yeah.
I just wanted to make sure Mr. Wheaton knew that. So this is the updated plan, Mr. Wheaton, that eliminated some of the blasting in front.
Yeah, there was 90 plus. It was close to 100 days in phase 1 before, and I think phase 2 didn't change. It was stuff at the entrance, so it did shave off quite a few days and quite a bit of quantity, the redesign. So
does that answer your question, Mr. Wheaton?
Bill, you're muted.
Yes, it does.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy.
Other questions from board members?
Yes, I have a question about the bedrock fracture study. And I noticed that the expert opinions are geared toward the groundwater wells on adjacent properties, but I have a concern for Beck Pond. And it appears to me that the first thing that would need to be done before anything else is undertaken is one of these fracture trace analysis, and to ascertain how the hydrogeology may or may not affect that pond. So in terms of the sequencing, am I correct in assuming that this study is the first order of business and it should precede any other work on this project?
So Ms. Crouch, I'm going to direct that question to Mr. Frappa. And this is not the first process, but this is the process to evaluate the site. And the necessary work had been done by GEI and by Maine Blasting. So if I may turn it over to Mr. Frappa to answer your questions, and then you can have any follow-up as necessary.
Sure. Hi, thank you for allowing us to speak. So to address the question regarding the details of the on-site hydrogeologic work, yes, we do plan on conducting a fracture trace analysis as well as a photolineament study that would require some tree clearing to be done so we get more bedrock exposure, and we can complete an on-site field reconnaissance to examine the surface of the rock, look for physical lineaments that are visible at the surface that are based on interpretations from aerial photographs, lidar mapping, and at that point, we'll review the data. We may end up with a more extensive type of geophysical investigation, where when we're drilling some of the test boreholes, we can do some downhole testing as well, using different geophysical tools to assess the extent of fractures. So that would be all done as part of the on-site work prior to any blasting, just to get a better handle on, what local fractures are present. The major fractures in the area have already been mapped through 100 years of USGS studies that have been conducted in the Massachusetts area. So the major faults are known, and if there was like direct hydraulic connection from the bedrock at they call it the Cape Ann Pluton, that would have been mapped already. So we're not anticipating any extensive fracturing to exist, but we would be able to identify if that does occur from our on-site analysis that we would do prior to the blasting program. I hope that answered your question.
Well, I don't purport to be a hydrogeologist in a matter of months, but it would appear to me that this is a very critical study, and I don't know to what extent it would, call a halt to the project. Is that conceivable?
Well, you have to understand the risk that's involved with this project. This is a development project, so the risk of contamination is extremely low. And if there is contamination, it really amounts to contamination by nitrate. We've eliminated any possibility of perchlorate contamination from occurring by basically not using perchlorate containing blasting materials, and then the use of the Blastex that is being proposed by the blaster, that is a pure ammonium nitrate explosive agent that's totally encased in like a wax. So it's highly insoluble in water. And that's the key, is that you don't want these things, the explosives to dissolve in water, because when they do dissolve, then you can release nitrate to the groundwater. So the material is completely encased and won't dissolve in water, so it doesn't produce nitrate. So the risk of contamination from the blasting process is virtually eliminated that way.
So that would also be why you don't want rainfall at that time, correct?
That's correct. That definitely helps. And you know, what happens when a blast essentially goes off, if you want to call it that, the ammonium nitrate essentially like detonates and then turns to gas. I mean, all of the nitrate is basically consumed in the explosion and is released in the form of nitrogen gas. So, you know, there's, you know, that's what we breathe. I mean, air is, you know, 78% roughly nitrogen, and so we're not really adding a chemical to the air by doing that. So I just want to make you aware of what, you know, what actually occurs when a blast is detonated, and what, in theory, the contaminants are. Historically, when you know, Jamie mentioned ANFO, that's an ammonium nitrate fuel oil containing charge, and that's not what's being used on this project. That's used for larger scale, like mine sites, big quarry projects, and they're, you know, they have a little less regard for environmental concerns, because typically those projects are distant from residential properties. So with this Blastex material, it's probably the most environmentally friendly blasting agent that can be used in the environment.
Thank you.
Well, wouldn't there be then another question? Say the blasting occurs as planned, and now we have a groundwater management system. And in the event that there were problems with that system, wouldn't any contaminants from impervious surfaces go down through these fractures and potentially affect the groundwater wells in Beck Pond?
Yeah, so
that's a separate question, but
yep, nope, understood. And that would happen if there were contaminants present that could enter fracture systems and migrate vertically downward. But like I said, we're working with ammonium and nitrate, and the detonation process basically consumes all of the nitrate. There may be some very low concentrations of residual nitrate that may be present, like on the surfaces of the rock fragments that are created from the blasting process. But that's why with the review that that Jamie had done from GZA, you know, he wanted us to upgrade our call it, you know, best management practices for how we handle the fractured rock on site that was blasted. So if we're not taking the material out and processing it, and we would be processing it or try to within 72 hours, and we would be doing that on lined materials. So we would construct a liner, and then they would crush the rock on top of the liner. If that wasn't able to be done within the first 72 hours, then we would simply put a tarp, or not a tarp, but we would put like a like either some sort of an HDPE sheeting or something on top of the material to prevent rainfall from percolating through those open fractures.
Mr. Chairman, in Ms. Crouch, I think your technical consultant, Mr. Emery, would like to speak. I see his hand.
Go ahead.
Just quickly to answer Mrs. Crouch's to kind of further that question. I think the study that I recommended, the photoliniment fracture fabric analysis, is not a fatal flaw necessarily the process. It's data that would be used to potentially modify the monitoring program and increase the overall ability for it would increase the amount of data that would be available to enhance the monitoring program. So I think it's a tool, it's not a tool that would necessarily, it wouldn't shut down the project. It would be something that would enhance the protection. And that's what I think one of the things that I want to make sure the intent of that study is really to get some more on-site data that will enhance the overall protection of the community. So that's all I had to say.
If I may, it seems that a lot of the testing that's being done is all pre-blasting, and that there's a lot of concern about the potential contaminants if the blasting materials are suspect. But I wonder if there's any fracture study post-blasting, whether there are any new fractures that perhaps open up as a result of blasting that could be determined in a pretty precise way. That might have long-term implications.
So you wouldn't necessarily in an analysis in analysis that would be looking at the fracture fabric of the rock, you're not going to change the fabric of that rock in any way in terms of your blasting. But what you might do is enhance an existing fabric through the blasting. And so that's why you would do the study, is to identify those existing areas that you might modify to those already existing fracture patterns to make sure that your monitoring program, and if one of the, let's say one of the monitoring wells that you're actually, your residential wells, or your monitoring is in line with one of those fracture systems, then you might choose to, as you're going through the analysis and the monitoring, you might want to enhance that a little bit in terms of making sure that that particular pathway is not going to create a problem. It's just really just to kind of give you an educated perspective on what you might expect, or what you want, you'd open your eyes a little bit wider maybe in one area versus another. So
I guess the follow-up question, is there a way then that you actually track where the water flows from the fracture? Can you determine that pretty accurately?
So yeah, in the fracture fabric analysis, I mean, you're looking through a dark, you're not seeing clearly below the Earth's surface.
Right.
But we do as scientists are able to identify preferred pathways that we think groundwater would preferably transmit through. And so it's not always 100%, the case, but we're going to have a reasonably good idea of the preferred pathways. And that gives us even more. I mean, if I knew a preferred pathway, they would move their muck piles away from that locality, right? That would be a benefit from that. They'd take their muck piles for their blasting and move it over to another portion of the more solid rock. We may move one of the proposed monitoring wells to be right on the pathway that we think is the most preferred pathway. So it gives us a little more flexibility to do, the best job you can. And we did that over this is not uncommon. It's not, a lot of projects don't do it, but I would say 50% of the blasting projects do a detailed, fabric analysis before they start blasting. And we found it to be very effective and helpful on the projects we've been involved in.
So basically, if I can make an observation, the reason the blasting goes for so many days is that you're going to do a lot of small blasts so that there is not a great deal of, I'm going to use the word spread, of contamination of the environment and locality around the blast area. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you want to continue to do the small bites. I'd let Andy describe that a little better, but that's
That's good.
You know, it might not be a bad idea, if I may, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Mitchell, if Andy, you could just explain what a day of blasting is, because people, I think, are thinking there's multiple blasts when in fact there are not. If you wouldn't mind explaining the length, the duration, and thank you.
Sure, I did see one of the questions asking to define a blast day versus a calendar day. It simply put, a blast day is a work day. So the state doesn't allow us to blast on Saturdays or Sundays. Therefore, we don't account for that. So that's why it'd be different from a calendar day. So it's a Monday through Friday. The blasting event itself is over in under a second. So we may do 2 blasts in a day. I don't think you would see more than that. We might do one mid-morning and one early afternoon to mid-afternoon. Our goal would be to do 1 blast a day. So we try to take all the work in a day and combine it into 1 blast. The issue with that, when we first get into a site, we have to develop a working face that would allow us enough work area to be able to do that. But the blast itself is over, you said, in under a second. So it's over very quickly. So.
And it's precipitated by some sort of a, I don't want to call it an alarm, but a horn by the fire department. Can you just explain that so that the board members can understand?
Yeah, so we have to have a warning signals in place per the state. And it says 5 minutes before the blast, we have to blow 3 horns. A minute before the blast, we blow 2 horns. Then the blast is detonated. The blaster will check and make sure everything is safe. And then 1 horn means basically you can get back to work. The code does state that the horns need to be audible for 250 feet. The only reason I say that is depending on the time of year, there's really, I know nobody really wants to hear this, but there's not a lot in close proximity to this blasting. We blast adjacent to hospitals, schools with additions. I mean, we blast in Boston, very densely populated areas. There's a possibility you won't hear the horns because you're too far away or it's winter and you have your windows closed. But we can offer a notification for those that don't want to be surprised by the blast. It's not state code, but as a company, we could notify via text, email, a voice call. It's a robocall, but a half an hour before the blast, the blaster will call our administrator and she can send out a notification to anybody in the public who wants to be notified. And that would be a way to get around that 250-foot audible code signal. So,
thank you very much.
I have a question about contamination. The discussion this evening is focused on contaminating, the possibility that groundwater is contaminated by the blast ingredients. When you do that much blasting, is there the possibility that you realign the underground rock so that the character of the water that people have in their wells changes? When I get my well water tested, they look for, arsenic and mercury and how much iron there is and everything else. And I think there's a neighborhood fear, which I don't know whether it's justified or not, that when you do that much blasting, what's going to happen is somehow underneath the surface, things are going to shift, and wells that previously didn't have any iron are going to be loaded with iron, and wells that previously didn't have any biological contaminants are going to have them because you've rearranged things under the ground. I mean, do you ever find that turns out to be a problem?
I can speak that, I guess, from the blaster's perspective, and then we can hear from one of the engineers. I've never seen that, happen, in practical experience. And what I always go back to, because I'm not a geologist, I'm not a hydrologist, I'm not an engineer, I'm a blaster, but the state requires us to hold our vibrations to a level where we can't damage the weakest construction material, cause cosmetic damage to, and that's laid on plaster material. That's what the state code holds us to for vibration. So with that being said, it's pretty hard for us. The reason we have to put our boreholes so closely together is because we have to make sure they overlap so we can actually fracture the rock. So the gases that are being created that Mr. Frappa spoke to earlier, that creates heave, which creates fragmentation. If we don't have those closely spaced together, we get what we call a high bottom, or we don't fragment the rock so the excavation contractor can dig it. There's been multiple times where we've been called back for what we call high bottom, meaning the rock just didn't break deep enough. For some reason or another, it was in between the two boreholes, and it tends to, in theory, break on a 45 on a 1-to-1. So we have to put our drill holes so they're spaced, so we intersect those 45s to be able to break the rock. So, you know, simply put, there's a saying that dynamite blows up, it don't blow down. It takes a lot to fragment rock, and I've never experienced us changing anything, you know, deeper down into the earth. So.
I'd just add to that a little bit. I would concur with that. We have not seen real substantial change in the water quality, but as a preventative effort, we had recommended that the domestic wells that are being monitored be sampled and analyzed for sodium, copper, iron, manganese, arsenic, calcium, aluminum, nitrate, and nitrite, and turbidity every 2 weeks during the time period. So there'll be an opportunity for that data to be collected, and for anybody that, you know, that data will be transparent, be available for the homeowner to see, it'll be available for the town to see, so that everybody, and not only just are they doing it on the residential wells, but they're also going to be doing it on-site wells too. So there's enough, I think, enough of a protective apron there to allow people to feel comfortable that the impacts of the blasting are not going to create an adverse impact. But personally, I'm in the same boat. I have not seen iron and manganese and arsenic impacted by the blasting. I'm not saying that could never happen, but I just haven't seen it.
I had a follow-up to Bill Wheaton's first question, actually, regarding the duration and quantity of blasted material. Was it 81 days? Phase 1 was 81 days with 162,000 cubic yards of material. Was that right?
That's correct.
So but quick math, phase 1, given Mr. Emery's maximum of 3 days for material being maintained at site, are we expecting about, did you estimate around 65 hauls per day during that period? Or did you have an estimate of the amount of trucks that might be leaving the site to take that material away?
So relative to the trucks, it will, you know, I mean, we don't
Sorry,
know.
that was a question for Mr. Dufault.
So our scope stops at the blasting, so we don't do the excavation or the trucking. We just
Right.
So that's why I interjected. So it's really about the site contractor, and we have talked to site contractors about it. And we anticipate, you know, maybe 40 truckloads a day. I mean, you don't know exactly until it happens, but we're anticipating to haul it off pretty closely to when it's blasted. We are anticipating using 97,000 cubic yards on site. So we are using a lot of the material on the site and then exporting the rest. And as far as the actual amount, I mean, I actually, I'm just opening up so that I can see what it is.
So, but this is the blasted material has to be, we're talking about the blasted material only, I guess. Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's got to be exported, right? It can't be reused.
We are using it. So we are going to be using 97,000 cubic yards of material on site out of that number that will be blasted. So the way it would haul out is each truck is about 28 cubic yards. So we're anticipating maybe, you know, 93 days of hauling in total. I mean, Mr. Norton, this is such an estimate, and it's based on, you know, but somewhere around that. And each truck hauls about 28 cubic yards. There's a lot of material to be hauled off site. Most certainly there is. You know, we can.
Yeah, I think that is. So about 45 trucks a day, maybe at peak for some period.
That's a great estimate. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Jonathan, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I wondered if this might be a perfect segue. And what's awesome here is we've got sort of like a roundtable discussion format. And what I might do is there's sort of two components to what I was going to present. And if I present the first component, I think, it's got some good questions in it that I think could spark discussion. So I'm going to sort of retailor what I was going to present to this roundtable, if that's okay with everyone.
Why not?
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Okay, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to share my screen. I put together some visuals because all of this is so, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All of this is so arcane and abstract for board members. And I'm not an engineer, I'm not a blasting engineer, I'm not a geotech, but I have been around blasting for various reasons and purposes for nearly 40 years. A lot of it on slopes, a lot of it near sensitive areas. So I thought from sort of a layperson's vantage point, I would put together just a couple cartoons in a sense to help the board members understand a little bit what's going on, and then apply these cartoons to a couple of the site conditions. And what would be great is with all these consultants right here, we could have a discussion and maybe answer some questions. So what I was really focusing on is sort of the relationship between blasting, topography, hydrology, and hydrogeology, which I thought that was kind of our agenda tonight. So what I did, for some reason, I can't get this. I can't get the slides to move. I don't know why.
Click. Try clicking.
There we go. Okay, so I made a little cartoon of a typical hillside. Everybody see my screen? Everybody see my cursor?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So we have the sort of a typical ledgy slope with the trees, the tree canopy. Then there's a layer of duff, which is the detritus on the forest floor. And then often there's sort of a root mat and soil mat that is spread broadly over the ledge, and it tends to sort of weave into the ledge a bit. And then they've been talking about the fractures and fissures in the hill. And this is just sort of a cartoon of more the localized, not the big picture fissures that they've been talking about, looking at downslope sort of conditions. This is sort of more a localized pattern. And I know that given every condition and every geological formation, there's a pattern, and I guess they even call it a family of fractures and discontinuities. And that's beyond my pay grade here, but I do know that there's tends to be sort of a pattern of that. And so what I also know is that the first steps in blasting are often to either strip portions or all of the trees and the cover away so that they can really see the patterns of the fractures and then decide where their drill holes go and what angles they go and how frequently they go. And what hasn't been talked about is that what's being proposed here is controlled blasting, which in my experience is actually pretty surgically precise in terms of what shape you get when you're done. Mr. DeFore, I'm sure, could address that, but we don't need to know a lot of detail about it. But I just know from experience that you can be pretty precise about the shape that you cut out of the hillside. You can slope it, you can step it, you can do all sorts of things with it. And previously, Ms. Mann had mentioned that it's almost like peeling the hillside out. And a couple of folks have asked about, what happens when you do blast? Does it disturb anything else? And what I found with controlled blasting is there's very little damage to the remaining face, and most of the forces go out and up, and they're absorbed by the blasting mats, and you get a pretty clean kind of cut depending upon what the joints and fissures are, and it's pretty surgical. And on top of that, the actual blast itself, as experienced by abutters, is kind of a low pitched thump, and it's really not very alarming. What's usually more bothersome is the drilling beforehand and the scraping afterwards. Those are sort of the noises that are more concerning by neighbors. So I think that it's helpful for the board members to understand kind of how surgical the blasting is, and Mr. DeFore can probably attest to that. That you haven't really talked about the difference between controlled blasting and other types of blasting. It's you mentioned the small drill holes. You mentioned how carefully you read the surface and really take this out in sections. So that part, I think, is really you've been very thorough also about the studies and the blast plan to be careful of downslope resources and the neighbors and the wells, and I appreciate that as a board member. So my question is really more an upslope question. So I just want to quickly for the board talk about the difference between hydrology and hydrogeology. So hydrology, my understanding is pretty much how the water runs across the surface, and that behavior. And then hydrogeology is how it runs across the below the surface. And again, you've talked about downslope hydrogeology and how you would monitor the wells and monitor the groundwater and whatnot. I want to talk a little bit about upslope and ask some questions about that. So if there's a depression up above, we've got kind of maybe a little bit of a different water table. If there's a depression, we've got water coming over the surface of the slope, the ledge face rather. We've got water slowly going through the fissures, and those fissures could be hairline cracks, they could be bigger, they could be filled with decayed stone, they could be filled with almost any material. And the water moves through at different rates, and then is also tempered by the forest mat before ledge removal. So then I just wanted to show the board after ledge removal, you can get things called seeps. And Mr. DeFore could also talk about that maybe a little bit, and maybe the hydrogeologists present could talk about that. And the seeps, in my experience, have varied from like a couple drips, like a drippy faucet, to fairly strong sort of steady streams, even sort of gushers. And what I've always struggled with in my work is predicting and controlling those seeps. There's always ways to manage them afterwards, but I find that they're hard to predict. And that's one of my first questions, is sort of predicting and controlling seeps. And so, and in the particular case, and the reason I bring this up is in the particular case of this project, for example, at this unit here, former unit 29, now unit 31, we have a roughly a 40-foot cut with about a 30-foot vertical face being proposed here. And that abuts a vernal pool a little below and a wetland up above. This is from the plan when it was a slope, a grass slope, but now we have a revised plan where it's a sheer cut, and it's pretty close to the buffer zone here. And so this cartoon isn't too far off from kind of what's happening there. Now I know that the wetland isn't right close to the edge, it's 100 feet away, but there is a network of fissures that's likely going to be slowly draining that wetland, otherwise it would be a pond upslope there. So I'd love to pause there and just have folks on the panel here just talk about that a little bit. Shall I leave my screen up, or should I stop sharing?
No, you can leave your screen up. That's fine. This is Rick Frappa speaking from GEI. So I think your cartoons were like spot on. And I thought you did a really good job in describing, what would, how blasting is done, the ledge control, the movement of water from a hydrological standpoint, which is basically the surface water type flow. And then the hydrogeology portion, I just want to dive into a little bit here. So what you said about seeps, I would say that would be, yeah, perfect. So in sedimentary rock, where the bedrock stratigraphy is either flatlined or at high angle type of deposition, you'll see seeps that would occur between bedding plane fractures, which can be on the size of millimeter size fractures. And the diagram that you show basically supports more of a sedimentary type of bedrock condition. The rock at the site is a granite, and the granite does have some what we call secondary porosity. That would be these microfractures that are present, but the fractures are typically measured. We call them aperture widths. They're measured in the order of microns to a millimeter typically at the most, and there's really no pattern to the frequency of these fractures, and they tend to transmit very small amounts of water, and so you wouldn't expect there to be any free flowing water that would be seeping from a rock face that was exposed from the blasting. Now, that's not to say that wouldn't occur, but the likelihood of that occurring in a granite compared to a sedimentary rock is much lower.
Can I pause there for just a second to
Sure.
sort of clarify my question?
Mhm.
So I don't know whether everybody's still oriented. This plan is spun. So we were just focusing on this unit here, and we were looking at the revised entry plan that showed a shear cut here, 40-ish feet, and this plan is spun. But I just wanted to sort of take that to the next level, where here's our wetland, upslope wetland, and then there's blasting being proposed pretty much all the way around here. There's some places where there's not much, but there's some places where it's greater, but we're sort of ringing this wetland with cuts. And so I guess my question is one of, I hear you what you're saying about the size of the fractures and fissures. And I guess my question is, with the idea of ringing this wetland with cuts, what do you think the likelihood of changing the behavior of this wetland would be with what's being proposed? And I haven't seen yet, if I may back up for just a second. We've seen, this is a revision to a plan, if you're not up to speed on it, where this used to be a slope and now it's a vertical cut. But we haven't really heard, there's the match line where that design ended. We haven't really heard what's happening beyond that match line. And there may be some revision that's yet to come. But for the moment, I'm assuming it's slopes, not vertical cuts here, but there's still cuts. So sorry to ramble on about that, but that's basically, so bigger picture and kind of probability wise, how would you respond to that?
So obviously, Topography controls the movement of surface water. So things want to flow downhill, right? And, you know, a lot of these vernal pools are present because of the existing topography that surrounds them. So sometimes you get a little flatline spot. But most frequently, what happens is you have very low permeability material below the area where these pools exist. So there's basically no place for the water to go because there's low hydraulic connectivity beneath where these wetland areas occur. So by blasting around the perimeter of the wetland, you're not changing the fracture network below where the vernal pool or the wetland area is. That wouldn't there wouldn't be any impact to the hydrogeologic conditions that exist beneath where this wetland is. So it would all then be topographically controlled, and the surface water that would then accumulate within that wetland area would essentially just remain there and discharge, either through, vertical percolation slowly through whatever fractures are maintained there, or evaporate during, the late spring, early, or through the summer and early fall time period.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And what I think is interesting is to what you just said. I believe the way the buffer zone works and the way the topography works, I think for the most part, that particular wetland is kind of a bowl, and their blasting is outboard of that bowl. So what you're saying is that if this is again, this is a cartoon. If this were the wetland, which is more like 100 feet away from the removals, that the water would seep through this so slowly that it wouldn't matter that the edges were dropped down below the edge of it, is what I hear you're saying, because the shape of the bowl remains, so the surface topography the behavior hasn't changed, and any vertical or sloped cut out at the edge of the buffer zone should not affect it. Is that what is that true what you're saying?
Rick, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yep, now I'm off. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, that's exactly correct. So in your diagram, where the roots exist at the ground surface, you see very few downward flow arrows entering the fractured rock in this scenario here. There would just be very few arrows moving in that downward direction, just because of the low hydraulic connectivity of the rock.
Right.
So,
Okay.
Jonathan, I don't want to cut you off, but we
Yes,
do want to.
that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. So I want to make sure that the public and Save Tobacco Woods participants have time to respond, and I know they have a presentation at about 8:34. So unless the board has other specific questions of the consultants and applicant, then I'd like to move on to that. If they're doing that.
Hey, Mr. Chair, I have a letter that I'd like to read that I received from Jim Younger today regarding the project. I did send it out to the board, but I did also commit to reading the letter. He says, "Dear Mr. Reffitt, unfortunately, I expect I will not be able to attend tonight's meeting. Thank you in advance for agreeing to read my letter into the record. I have been watching the proceedings of the Hamilton Planning Board carefully, as the decisions you will make will have an irrevocable impact on among other things, the natural resources and natural systems that serve Hamilton, Essex, Manchester, and the surrounding communities. Currently, we know that this proposed development poses serious risk of contamination to this vital watershed. This is not hyperbole. I urge you to look carefully at the design proposal before you and ensure that you have all the information you need before making a decision. To understand what is going on below the surface, I urge you to request a complete hydrogeological study. Such a study is needed to assess the risks and impacts of the proposed development on the underground aquifer. I also urge you to review the purpose of the town's Hamilton's bylaws and its site plan review process 10.6. While the site may be developed, the current proposal turns its back on the natural system and characteristics of the rocky forested slopes, violating all 5 tenets of the proposed Hamilton zoning bylaws. This is not acceptable. There are generations of people that will inherit the legacy of your decisions as stewards of the town and its limited resources. Thank you for listening. Regards, Jim Younger.
Okay, so I think now we want to turn it over to Jill. You might have had the list of people that wanted to talk, and I know Attorney Eliason is part of that group, so I'm wondering if we can get them on.
Just promoted Miss Eliason to panelist.
Okay, Deborah, we see you on screen, but not visual. There you are.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Deborah Ellison, Ellison Law Office, 63 Middle Street, Gloucester, Mass. Ransom Engineering would like to do a presentation for the board. So I would ask that Elizabeth Ransom, Tom Hennigan, and Elizabeth, there's another person from her office that she can tell you who that is when he comes on, when she comes on. I don't have
and these, just, can you categorize who these people are? What?
They are our consultants, and they are geologists and specialists in that area. They can give you their credentials much better than I can.
Okay, very good.
Elizabeth, who is the other Tom last
The
name?
other one would be Tom Nelson.
Okay,
Looks like Nielsen if you're looking for the spelling.
Thank you.
Go
Mr.
ahead,
Chairman.
Elizabeth.
I think actually Tom Nelson's going to be the one that starts, so hopefully he can be promoted first.
I just promoted Mr.
Yep.
Nielsen.
Thank you.
We see you, Tom, but we don't have a visual and we don't hear you. There we go.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And thank you to the board for allowing us to speak. If possible, I'd like to share my screen.
Sure. Can you identify what your area of expertise is?
Yes, I'm a geologist at Ransom Consulting. I specialize in identifying groundwater resources, contaminant, fate, and transport in groundwater through both overburden and bedrock aquifers, and in monitoring those systems.
Thank you.
Bear with me for a moment while I bring up this presentation. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
So myself and Elizabeth and Tom Hennigan will be presenting about this proposed development and the potential hydrogeologic and hydrologic impacts of it. So I know that Mr. Poor spent a little bit of time on this earlier, so I won't belabor the point. I did want to discuss a little bit about the difference between hydrology and hydrogeology. Hydrology typically is the study of water as it moves across the Earth's surface and through the atmosphere. Hydrogeology typically deals with water flow through geologic materials. So that would be overburden or unconfined aquifers, sand and gravel, and other such materials, as well as bedrock aquifers. And in this case, we're looking at both of those. And you'll see an intersection of hydrology and hydrogeology where surface water enters groundwater and vice versa, groundwater can return to surface water. So you see that illustrated in these diagrams here on the right. And this lower diagram is not atypical of a system that we're looking at in this setting, where the development might be located up on the recharge zone where you see these homes. There are wells in both the overburden and the bedrock, and groundwater will typically flow down towards Beck Pond, the other ponds in the area, and eventually the ocean. So what you're looking at here is a map that comes from the Mass GIS mapper. What you can see on this map are the major surface water features. So you have Beck Pond, Tobacco Lake, Round Pond, Gravelly Pond. You can see in pink the tax boundaries for the parcels. In this light yellow color, you can see the mapped aquifer units. These, I would note, are somewhat altered by administrative purposes. The aquifers themselves extend quite a bit further. And then you'll see wetlands in blue and the development location located here on this parcel. And one of the things to note about the development is that it's proposed for a bedrock knoll, essentially. And that knoll is surrounded by low-lying wetlands that are connected to a network of surface water features and aquifers that support those surface water features. So in this instance, you have associated with that surface water wetland system, the water supplies for the town of Hamilton. You have the school gravel pack well here to the northwest. You have water supply wells for Essex to the north on the north end of Tobacco Lake. You have 2 water supply wells for the town of Manchester by the Sea that are surrounding Round Pond that pump water into Gravelly Pond, which is then used for the Manchester by the Sea public water supply. And what you see in this system is that you have these very low-lying wetlands that connect all of these surface water features. And so what we're looking at here is a Google Earth screenshot, and you can see this yellow transect that starts roughly in the location of the proposed septic system, goes over towards the farm fields that are located to the north of the proposed development, crosses the development, goes across Beck Pond and out into Tobacco Lake. And below that, you can see an elevation profile. So the septic location for reference is located down here at the edge of the wetland. That wetland then would flow down towards Meadow Brook, which would flow under Tobacco Road and into Beck Pond. You can see the site here shown by this large topographic ridge. And then you can see the elevation of Beck Pond, the wetlands separating Beck Pond from Tobacco Lake and Tobacco Lake. And the key thing to note here is that these surface water bodies are essentially the same elevation. So Beck Pond is roughly 40 feet above sea level. Tobacco Lake is 40 feet above sea level. Round Pond is 40 feet above sea level. And Gravelly Pond sits at 40 feet above sea level, plus or minus a little bit, depending on the amount of water that's been withdrawn for public water. So what you have here is this interconnected wetland system and surface water system. And beneath the wetlands are a sand and gravel aquifer, very coarse deposits. Water moves quite easily through them. Changes in elevation to Beck Pond or Tobacco Lake or Gravelly Pond can easily change the direction of groundwater flow between these ponds. And certainly over time, the water within these ponds will communicate back and forth. And then you have the site located here, topographically above, where runoff from the site and discharge from the septic would be running into the wetland and aquifer units here, which would eventually make their way to Beck Pond. So I've been discussing the sand and gravel aquifers surrounding the site, which can provide very high quality and highly productive public water supplies, both from the surface water supported by the aquifer and from the aquifer itself. And then you have a bedrock aquifer that is typically a little less common to see public water supply wells located in, but is certainly common to have domestic wells and occasionally high producing wells. The key to understanding the interaction between bedrock aquifers, sand and gravel aquifers, and surface water is really understanding the fracture networks within the bedrock and how they relate to that overlying material. And there's been quite a bit of discussion on the fracture networks in bedrock today related to blasting. And I think that the key here is that you really can't characterize the system here without having some data in the field. So in the case of talking about groundwater flow through fractures, it's really important to understand where those fractures, how those fractures are oriented, what the pattern is for those fractures, and how productive they are. What you can see here is essentially a map view of some theoretical groundwater fractures. If you have the potentiometric surface, so the elevation of water suggests in wells suggests that groundwater might flow to the west. In reality, it would flow to the south, or sorry, to the east rather. In reality, it would flow to the southeast because the fractures are oriented such that that's the direction groundwater would go. So in order to do that, you need to have very careful study of the site itself. You can't necessarily rely on a desktop evaluation to come to those sorts of conclusions. And in this instance, really, we have a bedrock aquifer that's relied on by private well owners. We have an overburden system that is connected to surface water ponds and aquifers that are relied on by public water supplies for 3 different towns. And we have very little information to actually characterize the true conditions on site. Instead, we have a lot of discussion about what those conditions might be, and specific to the blasting plan, a plan to understand those conditions within a relatively small context. But we have very little information about how the broader picture might be impacted by the proposed development. So what you can see here is another screenshot from the Mass GIS mapper. You'll see the development area here in the middle. Wetlands are shown by this hatchered pattern. The administrative aquifer boundaries are shown in this green color. And then the core sand and gravel unit is shown in this sort of light orange color. And what I'd like to point out here is that there are a number of sensitive receptors that could potentially be impacted by the development in the immediate vicinity of the development. So you have septic proposed to be discharged here. That is a very short distance away from the irrigation pond that is likely supported by the sand and gravel aquifer that the septic would be discharged in. There is a surface water feature, a stream that runs through this wetland directly to Beck Pond. Beck Pond is has potential for a future water supply for the town of Hamilton. It's certainly a resource that deserves to be considered as any in the context of any development that would be nearby. And then you have homes over here that rely on private wells, both in the bedrock and in the overburden aquifer. So within this very narrow area, you have a number of receptors that have the potential to be impacted by changes to the site due to development, from blasting, from septic discharge, from stormwater runoff. And there's a real absence of on-site information to support what the potential impacts to those features might actually be. So to date, there's not really anything to show what the risk is, how likely that it is for that risk to occur, and how that might be mitigated in the development. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Elizabeth to continue talking.
Thank you. I just have to figure out how to get myself unmuted if I'm, can people hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. So as Tom pointed out, there are a number of sensitive receptors immediately adjacent to the site, as well as regionally significant receptors. And while the team, and you know, we work also with main drilling and blasting, we have certainly worked on a number of projects historically with GEI and GZA. And we know you have a well-respected team of scientists working on behalf of the development. But I think we've so far seen that their work has been focused primarily on the short-term effects from blasting. And even the proposals that are on the table for additional study are focused very much on when we blast, do those blast chemicals cause an impact? But what we're trying to do with this presentation is help the board understand some of the other more long-term impacts that can be possible with a project of this nature and of this size, and what is typically done to evaluate those risks in advance of making a decision on the project. So Tom, if I could have the next slide. You know, as mentioned previously in the peer review, Emery and Garrett, GZA, indicated that there should be additional characterization to look at the potential impacts for blasting on the development. But again, that was focused really on the blasting, not on the development as a whole. So that blasted material right now, we don't know the degree to which those fractures are storing water. We don't know the degree to which the fractures that may be in that bedrock could be transporting water, or where that's being transported. We don't know anything about the nature of that groundwater right now. So is it, I think actually maybe Mr. Poor had mentioned, you know, arsenic or iron. We don't know anything about those concentrations right now. And so although I believe it was the GZA peer review that suggested, you know, 30-day prior to blasting, evaluating some of those things, you know, we would suggest that concept is built on. I think GEI had kind of suggested that be developed as more of a seasonal monitoring program, so that people could evaluate the water level variations. But again, their program has been very focused on the blasting, and as Mr. Poor had put it, sort of the down slope effects from the blasting. But there really hasn't been a comprehensive review by any of the peer reviewers on the hydrogeologic impacts from the project as a whole, because there is no comprehensive hydrogeologic study. You know, right now what we have is some desktop analysis and not some site-specific data. So if we can go to the next slide, you know, this is just a kind of quick snippet of some of the things in the bylaw, but you know, part of the purpose of the zoning bylaws in town is to help the board make decisions that are going to protect the natural features and environmental values of the site and the neighboring properties. And whether it's a groundwater protection overlay district or not, it's also very much in the board's purview to conserve the natural resources of the town. And so, you know, part of what we hope to be conveying in tonight's presentation is this is all linked, right? It's not, you know, again, it's not that we're just focused on the short-term impacts of blasting on the Chabaco Road homeowner wells. We're focused on how does the overall development the 100 and some odd days of blasting days and the days of just simply doing construction and the potential risk to the site, not only during the construction period, but also during the full development when people are living there and using lawn fertilizers and so forth, is that ultimately going to be nitrogen and phosphorus that gets into Beck Pond and then impedes somebody from using that as a water supply down the road? And right now, I think we are seeing that there's an absence of site-specific data to be drawing conclusions. Can we have the next slide, Tom? So what are the things that we would suggest? I mean, what we've typically seen on projects that we're working on that are of similar size is that it's not unusual to ask for a long-term, 1 year or greater hydrogeologic and hydrologic data study to characterize the natural system. The reason we do this over the course of a year is so that we can develop an understanding of seasonal differences. We've all seen some severe droughts over the last decade that have greatly changed how water might interact on a site. And so when we're trying to understand, for example, the interaction between the vernal pools and the fractured rock and changes in our water table, it's helpful to look at those not just at one time a year, but through spring, summer, fall, and winter changes. We want to understand through fracture assessment and mapping, not just from a desktop or LiDAR study, but through actual downhole geophysics, a hydraulic assessment of the aquifer, the direction of groundwater flow, and an understanding of groundwater quality. We want to know, what is the thickness of the overburden aquifer? Do we know what the interaction is between that overburden aquifer and the bedrock? And have we seen an understanding of a fate and transport model of that septic system? Do we know what it's going to be doing to the stream and the wetlands and the irrigation pond? Has anybody looked at that when the interaction between that proposed system and when the pond is pumping, when they're actively irrigating their field versus when it's lying static? I don't believe we've seen any of that data to suggest that they've even done a fate and transport model of how the septic system is intended to behave. And, we need to understand what's the current health of our wetlands and our ponds that people are relying on in the community for their drinking water supply. Are we at a sort of tipping point already with those systems, or are they in good health? Because you don't want to run the risk of kind of sending them over the edge of where they are currently providing good potable water for people. And, really, the applicant has the burden of proof to show that this development is not going to cause an unreasonable risk. Next slide, Tom. With that, I think we're going to turn to Tom Hennigan for a bit to go through some of the hydrologic concerns, I think, and then we'll take a step back at the end to kind of summarize.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. And thanks to the board for the time. As Elizabeth mentioned, Tom had talked a little bit about the hydrogeology, and I'm going to talk about the hydrology. As we know, the existing site is predominantly a forested site. Sort of that hydrologic runoff from the site was well illustrated by Mr. Poor's graphics. As Tom mentioned, the site is essentially kind of a hill or a bedrock knoll. The graphic you see on this slide is essentially the layout of the proposed development on that hill, and you can see kind of highlighted in light blue the wetlands around the perimeter of the site. So under existing conditions, the water sort of flows off overland, kind of in each direction to those wetlands. Now they're, for the most part, hydraulically connected, and as Tom laid out in sort of a bigger picture, they flow around the site into the streams and then out to the surface waters nearby. So as Attorney Mann mentioned at the outset, they're up, they have prepared, a detailed stormwater report, and as required by the state regulations, one of the requirements is to make sure that the runoff to the various locations on the site under the post-development condition are not greater than the pre-development condition, just to ensure that there's no flooding issues. So on the next slide, you'll see sort of looking at that pre and post analysis and the water balance. This figure here is taken from the applicant's stormwater report, and I've just highlighted it to show that under the existing conditions, the pre-development conditions were divided into 3 drainage areas, and you see the light blue area there that drains to the street, the pink area next to it that sort of flows off to adjacent property, and then a majority of the site represented by the area that flows to the surrounding wetlands. So not in any particular direction, but to any of those wetlands all the way around that I had shown on the previous slide. And then including up at the top there, kind of on the west end, top of the figure, that darker blue polygon that represents a vernal pool that exists within the wetlands in that area. So again, the water flows off the hill to the north, the south, and the west to the wetland system, and then flows through. So you can see on the next slide is sort of the post-development analysis of the hydrology. And as I said, as part of the requirements, it's necessary to compare the pre-development runoff to the post-development runoff. So to do that, you really need to use the same drainage areas. But from this, you can see that drainage area C, the green, because that's what includes almost the entirety of the development. That really needs to be divided up into numerous sub areas, based on the engineering design with pipes and ponds and catch basins and roof drains. And as a result, that kind of gets divided up, and it's tough to see on this graphic, but you can see a lot of black dotted lines through there. And those are all smaller sub areas that are included in the applicant's calculation. But as they collect the water to detain it, to slow it down, as well as to treat it, it gets routed off into different directions. So you could see sort of on the north side, or sort of the right-hand side of the parcel, you can see there's three outfalls there represented by those red circles, and that's different outfalls from the proposed drainage system as part of the development. So in their analysis, to sort of aggregate all those different outfalls and all the runoff to that area, to that area C. But it's important to note that or to understand whether or not, even though it's still the discharge from that area C, if it's all being sort of aggregated or congregating more into one select area versus being more evenly distributed as it was in the existing conditions. And again, part of the reason we bring that up is again, up on that west end, there's that blue vernal pool, which is a pretty large certified vernal pool. And there's also some other vernal pool habitat within those wetlands that haven't yet been certified. But it's important if that vernal pool is then denied some of the flows that it typically receives because it's being routed to another part of the wetland, and that may impact the resources. So if you go to the reason that's important, if you go to the next slide, I just pasted in here sort of the definition of vernal pool from the wetland regulations in the blue box on the left, which I won't read, but there's 2 bullets pulled out of that, with the definition of vernal pool being a confined basin depression, which in most years holds water for a minimum of 2 continuous months. So you can see that if in that a lot of the stormwater is routed over to another part of the wetland and doesn't get to that vernal pool may cease to exist. And the reason that's important, and it's regulated by the state, as it says here, is it's a central breeding habitat. It provides extremely important wildlife habitat during both breeding and non-breeding seasons, and it's just an important habitat for other wildlife species. So as Attorney Mann mentioned, they did provide a very detailed stormwater report, but just the way it was presented, it's difficult to discern because of the broad nature of that largest drainage area of where the water is really going, and if that water balance is still to that wetland is still the same as it they're under existing conditions. So I'd certainly like to understand that better and have that made a little bit more clear. So that's a little bit on the hydrology piece. On the next slide, I had prepared the slide originally to talk about sort of the cut and fill analysis. Previously, this color-coded figure for the cut fill was all we had seen of a cut fill analysis. And although you can gauge from it the order of magnitude of the cut, and in the locations where there'll be 20 to 30 feet of cut in the blue, and obviously the the green being the areas that need to be filled, and there being much more cut than fill. We didn't have the numbers, but I was certainly happy to hear tonight, finally get a number put to that of the 188,000 cubic yards of rock to be blasted, and it sounds like about half of that will remain. About half of that will remain on site, and about half of that will be trucked off. We did talk a little bit about the blast rock and the treatment of those muck piles being covered with HDPE tarps before the materials placed and used on site. But as part of that, would recommend also that the applicant provides kind of that management plan or a schedule on how from the time the rock's blasted, and I assume if it's going to be reused on site, it needs to be processed in some way. So if we're talking about 90,000, 95,000 cubic yards of rock to remain on site to be used, there's obviously a significant operation to get that processed, keep it covered, or, until it's placed. So, definitely tonight, there's definitely some more information being presented, which is good to see, but, I think there's still, be good to get a little bit more clarity on the operation and how all that material is going to be handled throughout construction, so to protect the environment. Because if you go to the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about the topography. Here's just a couple excerpts from the drainage, from the grading plans, excuse me. And as you can see, I've just highlighted some areas where there are steep slopes that are 2-to-1 slopes, 2 horizontal feet to 1 vertical feet. As was addressed in some of the peer review comments from the board's peer reviewer, that any slopes greater than 3-to-1 should receive erosion control blanket and some other erosion control protections. And here all the slopes are 2-to-1, so even steeper than that. I've highlighted some here that are 18 vertical feet from top to bottom, or 20, 15 to 20. So those are pretty significant slopes. And I think with these, part of this is, the erosion control fabric's important. It'll help to get those slopes established and protect against erosion. But 2-to-1 slopes are susceptible to erosion during construction. Additionally, that erosion control fabric is going to be put in place, after the slope and the grading is finalized and it's been loamed and seeded. But if you look at these 3 screenshots that I've put together here, these aren't isolated locations. I mean, the entire grading plan is like this. If it's not a house or a road or a driveway, it's essentially a 2-to-1 slope. So there's definitely, during construction, a lot of slopes to manage, and until and that are going to be susceptible to erosion until they're loamed and seeded and the fabric's on, and that grass starts to catch. So that becomes, a potential issue of erosion and runoff down to the, down into the resources. And if you look, you can see along here, in many cases, you have a 15 or 20 foot steep 2-to-1 slope, and the proposed edge of clearing is right at the toe of the slope. So in an instance when you have a serious rain event and you have some erosion and you have soil at the bottom that's inundating your erosion controls at the bottom, there's really not a good way to access and get equipment down that steep slope to clean that up, replace the erosion control. So it's just the way, there's a lot going on in this small area, in creating conditions that are, susceptible to erosion without, an easy way to protect and maintain that. So the other thing that's important to note is we'll have those slopes, and if, again, go back to Mr. Poor's graphics where you have that under existing conditions, you have the benefit of the tree cover, the forest duff, and the litter underneath. As we've talked about earlier tonight, through this blasting program, which is going to take up to more than 6 months, you're gonna cut those trees, you're gonna remove all that forest stuff that's slowing down this rainwater and this runoff, and a lot of this site is gonna be exposed down to exposed rock, which obviously is going to create a significant amount more runoff than you see under existing conditions. So I think management of this site and construction is going to be extremely important and challenging going forward. So I just wanted to highlight those points. And the last thing, and I think that this has been touched on already, this was just a figure at the site entrance showing the changes in grading. And again, just wanted to call your attention to it, particularly as, we talked to previous hearings about the planning board criteria, the siting criteria for the site to fit into the sort of the character of the neighborhood. And although, saved quite a bit of blasting and removed the houses from this area up at the front of the entrance, that these exposed granite or exposed ledge faces that are called out here are, 20 feet tall here along the entrance. And then, as was highlighted earlier, 30 feet tall behind the reference over here. So residents over here. So, those are, going to be significant features on the site. And obviously this 20-foot tall face, I'm sure you'll see as you drive down Chabaco Road. So again, that's all I have for my comments. I'll turn it back to Elizabeth for some closing comments.
So I'm wondering if we're going to have an opportunity for the applicant to respond to any of the concerns that you've mentioned.
Sure. I mean, we only have a couple more slides to go, and certainly if there are questions or
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, we just tried to summarize in a couple of slides some points that we would recommend. As we noted, the developer really should provide some additional comprehensive hydrogeologic assessment of the property that includes not just the focus on blasting, but a look at existing conditions and the sensitive receptors in the vicinity. This includes the irrigation pond, the wetlands, the water supplies. It really needs to focus on surface water, overburdened groundwater, and bedrock groundwater, and go beyond the desktop analysis that's been conducted to date. I think it's a great place to start, but when we're trying to make conclusions about potential impacts, we really need to understand what's on the site. And we believe that typically includes a full year of data collection, and it includes an analysis of all the protected resources, not just those within 1,000 feet of the blasting area. Next slide. We have, I think, in numerous previous meetings noted that the developer really needs to provide a construction sequencing plan so that we have a better understanding of how the resources are going to be protected during the tree removal and the blasting in all phases of construction. And, that's not just sort of looking at the, what's the end product going to be? What does this development look like when it's finished? But really, how do we get there? And how do we know that we're taking the right steps all the way through the construction process? Because as we've been hearing, this is not something, it's not a day of blasting, it's months of blasting and rock work and, probably years to get through the full build out. We also would like to encourage that the steep slopes in the design that are highly susceptible to erosion, particularly during construction, and don't really allow for adequate protection of the natural resources, should be modified in the final design. And, we also think the planning board needs to understand what the developer's plan is to correct damage should it occur. We all are hopeful that, we're putting a greater understanding to the site that's going to prevent the damage. But what happens if a private well is contaminated or runs dry? I mean, a typical thing is to say, well, all right, the developer needs to fix that. They need to, drill a new well. They need to rehabilitate the well. They need to provide water treatment. Or in a real worst case scenario, if the whole street had a problem, they'd have to, bring in a water line to supply them water. I'm not sure how you go about doing that. If there was to be a damage to a municipal supply, if all of a sudden we've got, algal blooms on one of the ponds and it's not adequate water quality, I'm not sure quite how you get there, but I think the planning board needs to, have an understanding of just how much can the developer do to protect against what is a possibility for the future should the development occur. And that's it. Be happy to entertain questions to me or either one of the Toms that have presented tonight.
I would love as a board member to ask a couple of questions.
I'd like, Bill,
You want to open
unless,
up to the public? I'll shut up.
if we can, I'd like to at least have the applicant be able to respond to some of the points made, and then have the board follow up with questions or comments.
Mr. Chairman, point of order, if I might. Our understanding was there was supposed to be equal time for the applicant as well as Save Tobacco and the public, and that we would be given an opportunity to have that discussion with the board and without interruption from the applicant. I believe the applicant had at least an hour and a half without interruption from us or discussion. So I would ask that board members be allowed to ask questions and that the remaining members of the public be allowed to speak, and then the applicant can certainly respond.
Well, Attorney Eliason, your consultants have presented some very detailed supposed weaknesses in the applicant's plan. I think it's only fair that the applicant at least has an initial opportunity to respond to those. And then the board will have a chance to ask questions of the consultant as well. And then the public, just in the same process we've been following. So you don't get to throw doubt onto the table and then walk away without being able to have questions asked by the applicant.
Mr. Chairman, I'd love to have the board discuss that a little bit further. I think we've kind of.
No, actually, Jonathan, we're not going to discuss this. This is how we do this. The applicant has made a presentation. The opposition has made a presentation. They've thrown certain questions at the applicant's information and presentation. It's only fair that they have a chance to respond to it, and then the board can have questions. So let's move on.
I believe this goes against what we agreed to in according to the minutes previously. So,
well, what would you like to do, Jonathan?
I would like to follow the agreed upon protocol, which is that the board, the applicant, and the public gets equal time.
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to do. So, well, go ahead, Jill. If you could briefly respond to that, and then we'll go back to the participants and the legal counsel and their consultants and the public.
I appreciate it. It'll be very quick. We didn't take a lot of time, and we don't plan on it now. So just in general, with regard to some of the comments, the Stormwater Report speaks for itself. It's been reviewed by your peer review engineer. We comply with everything. It's a formidable system, and this isn't supposed to be a discussion about the stormwater management plan, or we would have brought that up. The point of this evening is the hydrology and the impacts resulting from blasting. This is supposed to be a very concentrated presentation. Relative to the septic system, same exact thing. We have an approved septic system that complies completely with Title V. By the way, that current irrigation system is surrounded by a number of septic systems we don't hear mention of. But notwithstanding any of that, the septic system is an approved Title V septic system that's separated by more than the distance that's required by Title V. So I just want to put that on the table. And when we have a discussion, we can go back to that at other hearings. And I don't mind doing that, but there's supposed to be a focused discussion tonight. And then relative to, with regard to Ransom's comments, I mean, the whole first part of this entire presentation by Ransom was theoretical. I can have Mr. Mr. Frappa respond relative to needing a year's study. He's going to testify as to there's no need for a year's study. What we're proposing and what was sanctioned and actually agreed upon by the peer reviewer, who's an independent consultant, not one that works for us and most certainly not one that works for the opposition, is already told you what's necessary. And I think that what we need to do is allow potentially Mr. Frappa, Mr. Emery, and Mr. Christensen to have a discussion and can respond to some of those issues. Because again, ours is a practical response, not theoretical. So at this point, if I may, Mr. Mitchell, I'd love for Mr. Frappa to just address that. And that may end up feeding into comments by Mr. Poor as well as Mr. Wheaton.
So that's fine if you make those brief, because I don't want to turn this into a debate.
No, absolutely. Fast. Go ahead, Rick.
Okay, thank you. I will try to make this brief. If I can share my screen for a second, I just want to show you a map that identifies the groundwater protection district in the area of the project. And can everyone see my screen?
No.
Not yet. Not yet.
Oh, crap. I'm sorry.
Now we're starting.
Okay. So if you can see where my hand is here, this is where the project area is. Okay. This hatched line that extends all the way out along this area out here. This is the unconsolidated aquifer out here. Extends all the way to the north of Beck Pond, encompasses Beck Pond, and then extends eastward. So what wasn't presented was the full view of what the aquifer consists of. The area where the project is this granite pluton, which is what we call a non-aquifer area. So this transmits very little water. And what was said is that we should conduct a study to better understand the hydraulic characteristics of the area below where the development is occurring. Well, we do have information that exists from some of the local. This is getting moved. So from some of the existing private wells in the area along Chabaco Road. And you can see in this chart here, it shows many of these wells extending down to depths of, greater than 300 feet. So what that means is that they're extracting groundwater from the bedrock, okay? And the only reason that these wells are open for several hundred feet in depth is that they don't produce much water. You essentially be wasting money if you're trying to drill your well to a depth of between 400 and 600 feet and setting casing down to 100 feet if this granite produces a lot of water. So we know that this granite doesn't produce a lot of water. So from a hydrogeologic standpoint, by removing some of this rock that's present in the area where the project development is really inconsequential to the overall, hydrogeologic character of the area, because it's not going to have any impact whatsoever on the surrounding aquifer material or Beck Pond. So that's number one. Number two, we keep talking about contamination. Well, the explosives that we're using, and when we talked about this at the beginning, they're consists of just ammonium and nitrate. There's no perchlorate containing materials. We're not using ANFO. It's not a petroleum-based product. This is highly insoluble material where the ammonium nitrate is detonated and all of it's consumed in the explosion. So the rock that is then harvested may have some contact with the nitrous gas that is present on the fractured rock, but that is dug out and then managed such that it doesn't get exposed to stormwater. So really, the true development project has no impact on groundwater quality from the site. So I just want that to be on the record. And as far as doing like a detailed hydrogeologic study, I do a lot of those. That's what I do for a living. And we do those on big projects with a lot of risk. Those are sites where, you're constructing landfills or building quarries, where you're disturbing, hundreds or thousands of acres of material. And in this situation, this is, a little over 60 acres in size, and only a small 16-acre area is actually being disturbed. So the true hydrologic cycle that's present in this area of Chabaco is not going to be impacted by the work that this project is going to entail. And then some of the engineering analyses that were done, I can't comment on that, but I'm not sure if we had time to dive into those, but others from GEI could dig into that as well. But everything is being done in accordance with Massachusetts regulations, and so it's really what I wanted to say on that point. I know we're pressed for time.
All right, good. Thank you. So unless Julie, you have anything else, then I'd like to go back to Attorney Eliason.
No, absolutely. I appreciate being given the opportunity to clarify some misstatements. Thank you very much.
All right.
And
How
thank you,
about the
Mr.
board?
Chairman. Yes,
All
I
right,
would certainly like questions from the board, and also
Sure.
perhaps a short opportunity for someone to respond to Mr. Frappa.
So you'd like to have the board rather than you?
At this point, I would like to hear questions from the board, but yes, I would like to have an opportunity to speak, and there are many members from the public who would like to.
I understand that, and I'm trying to give you the opportunity to continue your presentation. But if you'd like to hear from the board, that's fine too. Board members, if you've got questions.
I have a very distinctive question that could be answered by both engineers or engineers from either side, which is, as I understand the presentation tonight, almost all of the land that's actually developed on this site occurs on bedrock, which means that all the rain that falls on that land now mostly is running off. It's running off into several different catchments. It may be running off 10 inches under the soil or 2 feet under the soil, but it's not percolating down to bedrock because it is bedrock. It's running off into the catchment areas. Now, once you develop this land, it's still going to be rock. You're not getting rid of the rock. A rock goes very, very deep. What you're doing is you're altering its surface features, and you're going to change the character of the runoff, but you're probably not going to change the volume of runoff, but a tiny bit, because the water has nowhere to go now but run off. And when you develop it, it's still going to run off. And so I fail to see how this development is going to greatly impact the runoff of water into the various ponds in the surrounding area. It's not like you're developing a field where you're changing percolation into runoff. Here, you're just changing one runoff into a slightly different runoff, but you're not going to alter the volume of water running off, are you?
I'll take the
first.
I'll-
What's going to be there?
I'd like to comment on that, Bill.
Yep.
First.
Wait a minute. So that was a question he had of the engineers, not the other board members. So
I thought it
Elizabeth,
was rock is rock. You're changing the character of the runoff, but not the amount of runoff.
Elizabeth, could you go ahead?
Yeah, I'll start. I'm sure others will have feedback as well. So the rock isn't solid material, right? We all have heard tonight that there are fractures to some degree in the rock. What we don't know is what direction those run, how interconnected they are, and where they carry that water. So what we do know is right now.
Let me carry on with that point. The several other engineers suggested that if of all the rainfall that falls on those 16 acres, I'm guessing 95% of it runs off, 99%. The fissures the engineers were talking about were tiny. They can't hold volumes of water. So it must be true that you know, almost all of the rain that falls there goes into runoff. Is that true?
That's part of our point. We don't have the information to say that, because I'm sure Mr. Emery can say just as many places he's familiar with as we are. There are plenty of bedrock aquifers that actually are have pumping wells in them, because the fractures are interconnected and do have a certain amount of water storage in them. And
but there was a discussion that that this is all granite, and that it
correct.
has
And there are
very, very low permeability, and that, you know,
potentially,
if that's true, then most of it is runoff.
Potentially, and that's the key word here is potentially. There are granite, there are wells installed in granite that are production wells for
but not in this
and
area,
municipalities.
not in this granite. Isn't this a question that the geologists who look at this area can assess fairly quickly?
With
I mean,
some
maybe it is
site-specific data,
armchair
absolutely.
theory.
Yeah, with some site-specific data, absolutely. You
And
can
how would, just out of curiosity, how would they get that data?
drill into the rock, put downhole geophysical instrumentation into the borehole, and look at whether or not they are seeing fracture apertures that are of size to carry water. They can look at fracture orientation with those downhole geophysics. I believe actually Mr. Rappa might have been the one who mentioned that earlier in the presentation tonight. There are ways of creating monitoring well networks where you can look at the pattern of flow, and where you can do pumping tests to evaluate whether there is almost no movement through this rock or a lot of movement through this rock. I think part of what we're trying to,
that we would know whether we have to, you know, whether we're altering the percolation of water, or we're just changing slightly its flowing off of the rock anyway. Right?
Right now, we don't know, because we don't have that site-specific data.
Well, why don't
but
we
I
do?
think
Why don't
you
we
can
find
obtain
out?
that.
And then we can put to rest a lot of the argument about the stormwater, because it's flowing off of the rock. It's either flowing off the rock now anyway, and we're just going to alter that slightly, as opposed to no, it's going through the rock, and we're going to change the whole pattern of flow.
But if you put holes in the rock, will water not flow into the rock from those holes? Into those holes?
You're creating a sealed well that basically you
asking
control that.
for your test holes to determine if there is a lot of water in the rock. If you drill holes in the rock, aren't you going to get water into the holes to show and prove that there is water there?
No, you're sealing them off from the surface, so the only water they're receiving is in
I'm
the
talking about the
screened
test
interval.
process. I'm talking about the test process.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. When you install a well, you're only screening a certain interval of that well if you're trying to build a well, and so you would not be allowing direct infiltration from the top of your hole. So when it rains, it's not going to go straight down the inside of your well.
I understand
it's going to follow the natural pattern.
Bedrock. We're not talking about bedrock that's 200 feet below the surface. We're talking about granite that's sitting up on top of the surface. And
can I
it
weigh in
strikes
for
me
just,
that there's not much. I'm totally willing to be convinced otherwise.
Can I weigh in just for a
My
second?
impression is there's not much.
Okay, hold on, guys. Hold on, guys. So, James, do you want to go? Go ahead.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I have to leave in like now, like half an hour ago, but I need to walk away. Unfortunately, and I'll
Thank
have
you
to
for staying.
respond if anybody sends me material. One of the things that needs to be understood is that we're not talking about a lot of we're not talking about 200 feet of depth of excavation here. We're talking about taking off the top of the rock, and this is an erosionally resistant body of rock. That's why it's a hill. And that indicates that it's less fractured and going to be an area that we would likely not pursue for any kind of water supply development. We would avoid this area. With that said, the fracture fabric assessment that we recommended is something that we think is worthy of looking at. But as I said it up front, it's not something I consider to be a fatal flaw to the process. It's something that should be a part of the process to enhance the overall protection of the local groups that are concerned about potentially being impaired. I want to make a mention before I go that off-site wells, we put in a tremendous amount of protections for the off-site wells in that we have recommended and the applicant has agreed, and this is unusual, to do sampling for iron, manganese, arsenic, and sodium and other parameters every 2 weeks throughout the entire blasting period. That's substantial, and I haven't had a project where we've done that before, but because of the nature of the dependency of the individuals nearby on their water supply, we felt that was reasonable. And also to be putting in monitoring of water levels every 30 minutes during the entire time period, so we can see if there's any change in water levels that would be impaired as a result. So there's a tremendous amount of data collection during the process. And if they do see, and I'm just putting this in for the benefit and the protection of the town, if there were things that were suspected to be problematic, then the modification to the blasting would occur, and they would make changes to accommodate and assure that there's no permanent damage. Turbidity is one thing that we're also going to be monitoring. And yes, there's going to be monitoring wells installed on the property, which will also help to determine the water bearing capacity of that rock. And that is part of this plan. There'll be 8 wells installed. So I want to be clear that it's an erosionally resistant hill, which indicates by itself that it's just not a highly fractured body of rock. And that we are recommending, even on top of that, that you would do some additional investigation. And I'm happy to address other people's questions at another time. Unfortunately, I have to pick up my wife, who's been patiently waiting for me for 45 minutes. But I will leave it up to the town to reach out to me to ask additional questions at some point. Chairman, I'm sorry for doing that. I didn't really expect this.
No, thank you.
To go that long, but
your wife is more important.
I will agree with that.
Thank you, James.
Okay. All right, so unless board members have any other questions, then I'd like to turn it back to Deborah Elias. Hearing none, Deborah?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to summarize a few things for you before we go on to the members of the public. I believe that Elizabeth raised questions about what happens if there is a failed system. Do you drill another well? What if you can't drill another well? These are people's potable water. This is why they're concerned. It's the only reason their house is habitable. If they don't have potable water, they do not have a habitable home. And the developer and their experts say it's unlikely to happen, but they don't know that because they have not done the study. Now, Mr. Emery says that they could get more information by doing the study, and he tells you that it's not necessary to do it now. Our experts suggest that it is necessary to do it now. It's something that the developer should have done during the due diligence, and they didn't. It's information that you should have before you make this decision, not afterwards. It's not acceptable to put people's wells at risk by waiting until something happens before you get that information. So what I would also like to point out is with regard to the blasting reports and blasting sites that they've shown, those reports go back to 2001, which is 20 years ago, and it shows 19 blast sites in that 20-year period. That's not an awful lot of blasting that's gone on over a 20-year period. Also, the vast majority of those are single-family home sites. There's no information on how much blasting was done in each case, but I would suggest to you that it's not 107 days of blasting with potential to blast each day. That's 214 blasts potentially. And we don't even know if that's what the case is going to be here because we don't know what's under the ground. So we don't know what type of blasting they're going to have to do. And that's 6 to 8 months is what they're telling you it's going to be. Those are their figures, not ours. The developers also calculated those figures based on removing or storing the property, the blast materials and processing it on site. That is what they suggested at their earlier presentations. Now they've agreed to remove it within 72 hours if they're not going to use it on site. And we don't know whether that's been factored into the blast plan and whether the 6 to 8 months is actually a shorter time than what we would expect. And obviously they don't know what they're going to encounter because they don't know what is under the ground. And maybe they'll have to do more blasting. Obviously, you're not going to limit them to the 107 days. You wouldn't do that. If they have to do more, they're going to do more. They'll be in the middle of the project. So I would suggest to you that that's something that is necessary to consider as you're looking at this permit. Also, it's very important, as we've said, that they provide you with the true hydrogeological study. That data can be obtained fairly easily, as the experts have stated. And until you know that, you're not protecting your constituents. The special permit, it's a special permit that specifically says that you have to protect the natural resources in several places. 8.2.13.2, you minimize disturbance. Leave as much of the site in its natural condition as possible. 8.2.31.2, minimize impact to abutting land and natural resources. And 10.5.2, you must determine that the adverse impacts of this project will not outweigh the benefit to the town and the neighborhood. And in doing that, you must look at the impact on the natural environment. So throughout your bylaw, it talks about these natural resources that you need to protect. The developer states that they're preserving the vast majority of the property, and they showed you a pretty picture with all the trees that they'll be left standing. But what they gloss over is that the only land they're not developing are the wetlands, the buffer, and the small farmland. Those are the only lands that they're not developing. The buffer zone and the wetlands are protected by the Wetland Protection Act. So when they say that they're preserving land, they're really not. The wetlands in all likelihood cannot be developed, and the buffer zone would have very limited development. So nobody is fooled by the 32 unit plan that they show you, the conventional plan as of right. That's not as of right. A lot of that work is being done in the wetlands and in the buffer, and it's not as of right. Lastly, you have to understand that this is a permit. This is not something that they are entitled to. And they don't have a right to develop 50 homes. There's nothing in your bylaw that says, anywhere in your bylaw, that requires you to make sure that the developer has an economically viable project. If the numbers don't work for him, then this site isn't the right site. It's not up to you to make it work. It's up to the developer to provide you with a project that complies with the requirements of your bylaws. And so far, they have yet to do that. Thank you very much for listening, and we appreciate the time that you've given us tonight. I know that there are members of the public who would like to speak, and Mr. Whitaker has asked if he could speak after me. Thank you.
Okay, Patrick, Pat, do you want to?
You just promoted Kenneth Whitaker.
Kenneth, you're muted and we don't see you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to kind of limit my comments. Deb Eliason hit a lot of them, so I'm just going to focus on a couple of points. I have no slides and I will not take more than several minutes. As some of you may be aware on the committee, my dual careers of an environmental attorney and environmental engineer have overlapped in the last couple of years with my role as a conservation commissioner in both Gloucester and Essex. So I know Cape Ann well. And for all the others who have been in that position, you don't get by without learning a lot about rock blasting. I can remember a number of cases that I've been involved in that for both Gloucester and Essex. You just can't avoid that. I can't remember anyone in all of those projects who ever said, everything went well and as planned without headaches. It's an inherent problem with that. What I can remember, unfortunately, is a lot of projects where the blasting and the chiseling was going on. And I was getting calls and saying, Ken, this is driving me crazy. Can't you stop this as a town official? And my answer always was, I wish I could, but I can't. They have the permit. I'm really concerned about the impacts of this on the neighborhood there, with particular attention to the huge numbers that we heard about this evening 190,000 cubic feet of rock being processed and blasted. You're looking at blasting 2,500 cubic feet. These are the small blasts Maine is talking about. We're talking about the equivalent of 13 and 14,000 trucks transporting rock on that site. And that rock needs to be processed. It just doesn't come out of the ground. It needs to be picked up. It needs to be moved. It needs to be graded. And they say they're going to use 97,000 cubic yards, but where? Take a look at the cut and fill. It's all cut. Where does the fill go? Is it just going to be spilled over to the edge on the steep slopes? Now, the point is, if you really want to understand what the impact on the neighborhood is going to be with all the rock processing that's going to go up there, stand on the third tee over at Ipswich Country Club and listen to what's going on at Welsh Allen. No, excuse me, not Welsh Allen. I've lost the name. You know the rock crushing operation over there. It's loud. They're involved in litigation here. All the steps that have been taken to mitigate the noise have been unsuccessful. It's a terrible problem. The petitioner will argue that this is just a temporary disruption. Yeah, and yeah, that's right. It will end someday. But what kind of assurances do we have that this is going to go 6 months or 82 days or whatever? Assurances are cheap, and we don't really have the real data to really assess whether that's even practical. What I'm concerned here is, where does a temporary problem transform to an intolerable burden on homes and businesses? Who decides that? Who decides what the neighborhood is going to have to go through with regard to this? And fortunately or unfortunately, that's your decision on this. It's up to this board. I just asked the members of the board to ask themselves two questions. How does this project meet the overall purposes of the senior bylaw? We've talked about that in place. And secondly, if it was my neighborhood, how would I react and what would I do? Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Pat, do we have other people with?
It's 3 hands raised.
Okay, let's go.
4 now. Jessica Cagle, I'll be promoting now.
Jessica, you're on.
Hello, thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I have been taking school groups from several towns out to the Chewbacca Woods area to study the forest ecology and migratory amphibians for the last, almost 20 years now. And I just want to point out that I haven't heard of any impact study specifically on the migratory amphibians. We've documented 6 migratory amphibians plus fairy shrimp, all of which are breeding using the vernal pools in that area. Wood frogs, spring peepers, bullfrogs, green frogs, spotted salamanders, and eastern newts. And I'd have to go through my last many years of data to find out if there were any others. So every one of those 6 amphibians, they're migratory, so they're breeding in the vernal pools that will be impacted by this project. But the area, so the Wetlands Protection Act only legally protects a small buffer, but all of those migratory amphibians have an upland habitat outside the vernal pool that extends for half a mile beyond where their breeding pond is. So they're breeding in the ponds, but they spend all of those, except for the bullfrog and the green frog, the wood frog, the spring peeper, the spotted salamander, and the eastern newt in their adult stage, spends their time mostly under the ground and under fallen debris. Everywhere, for every vernal pool, there's a half-mile radius that is critical habitat. And one of the things I'm most concerned about is that when you're doing the blasting, most of these amphibians will be damaged, killed, or have their habitat destroyed because the vernal pool itself is, again, only where they go just to lay their eggs and only for the larval stage. They spend the majority of their lives in up to a half-mile radius around the area. So I'm just wondering if there's going to be specifically a breeding amphibian study. And again, those 6 are only the ones that my students and I have documented. That doesn't mean that there aren't more out there. We weren't doing an exhaustive study. As well as fairy shrimp, which if the hydro period is disrupted at all, the fairy shrimp won't be able to breed. And some of those species are actually on the endangered species list. We did not identify the fairy shrimp as species, but I am just raising that concern that they depend on specific hydro periods. So I'm just concerned that considering and protecting only the ponds themselves while developing so much of the land around the vernal pools will affect not only Chabaco trails, but Chabaco woods as well. Absolutely will be impacted because of the populations of salamanders. Additionally, those amphibians tend to all migrate within about a week of time in the spring at the same time. So the classic sort of understanding of big night is not just one night, but it's a series of wet nights in the spring, but entire populations migrate within a very short window. So adding a lot of car traffic and paved surfaces gives them more opportunities to dry out or be run over. And when you add more of these hazards, we can lose a large percentage of a breeding amphibian population in a single night or in a single week. And I know I didn't state my credentials in the beginning. I run a wildlife ecology nonprofit, and we actually specialize in vernal pools. We were founded as part of the Cape Ann Vernal Pond team, and we've split off as of almost 20 years ago. But I'm just concerned about the amphibians themselves, and what other amphibians that I haven't documented yet might also be using those upland habitats. And like I said, some of them actually use underground areas up to 3 feet underground is actually vital habitat for them. Spotted salamanders have 100% breeding site fidelity, which means that once they've chosen a breeding site, they can live for 25 years, and they absolutely have to breed in the same site every single year. If their way is obstructed, there's no breeding. If their pond hydro period is changed, there's no breeding. And that line is gone forever because they have 100% breeding site fidelity. They have 80% natal site fidelity, which means that 80% of them must go back for breeding in the pond where they were born, whereas 100% once they have selected their breeding pond can only breed in that pond. And if it's gone, they just keep going back to that spot anyway, and that line is gone.
All right, thank you, Jessica. Don't want to cut you off, but we have a lot of other people that would like to chime in. Thank you for your comments.
Just promoting Ron and Katie Vandy.
Ron and Katie and Dandy. Yep, I think we got a letter as well. Ron,
there we go. Hi, can you see and hear us okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak again and address this board. I'm Katie Vandy, and I'm here with my dad, Ron. And my brother, Michael, is also on the call. And we are the owners of Meadowbrook Farm in South Hamilton and direct abutters to the property. And in order to address some of the concerns I have this evening, which I will make brief because some of them have already been addressed here in the meeting tonight, but I just want to go back in time just really briefly because it shows that our concerns have been very valid for a very long time since the first mention of this project. So in April of 2021, we were offered a 99-year lease by the developer, but this was only on the condition that we sign an easement, which would have allowed the developer and the landowner to access a portion of our property for the proposed septic leach field, which, as was presented tonight, you could see is in very close proximity to our irrigation pond. This easement was unlimited in time and scope and stated the developer and the landowner would be granted a permanent, non-exclusive easement to pass and repass in, on, over, below, through, and across the easement area. So at that time, the only information we had about the development or the septic design was a rectangle drawing on a very early plan depicting a general idea of where the leach field would be placed. There was no detailed septic plans. There was also, as we talked about tonight, some of these hydrological studies or the flow of water or how this would all intertwine. So with such little information available to us at the time, it was very, it seemed highly irresponsible for us to sign such a legally binding agreement. And it would have been a document that would have provided, and this is important, the developer legal access to use our property for the construction and maintenance of something that does have the potential to contaminate our property with no factor details supporting its safety. And unfortunately, our decision to not sign that paperwork and wait for more detailed information resulted in the termination of our land lease by the landowner, which had been in place for decades. So with that said, I'd like to just briefly expand upon our continued concerns, not only as direct abutters, but from an agricultural perspective as farmers. And it's important to note that since the 1980s, our family was notified by the Massachusetts Department of Agriculture and the Department of Environmental Protection that the parcel of land we rented for farming was identified by the state to be associated with a high yield aquifer and are located close to outstanding resource waters associated with public water supplies. Our property at 247 Essex Street, which is also still being used for crop production, falls under this category. Our family does have a unique perspective of this farmland and the existing trails on this property, as Frank Rich, the previous landowner, commissioned my father, Ron, to help maintain the trails and property numerous times, so we know it well. The current layout of the forest floor allows stormwater runoff to be naturally absorbed by shallow soils. So with this natural layout in mind, a typical spring on the farmland is still extremely wet and unable to be farmed until late May or early June, when enough of the land has dried out. Without a current natural buffer of the water being allowed to absorb where it falls, the water will flow to the lowest level faster, resulting in an increase of lowland flooding and nutrient contamination. Any pest management, chemicals, fertilizers, or even chemicals from pressure-treated wood from the proposed development would flow directly into this area and potentially contaminate the area of the growing fields, trails, and wetlands. So in other words, the runoff from the proposed development may end up in an area which concerns the aquifers. This includes our own property and the abutters. Furthermore, the primary discharge basin for the development is what appears to be in close proximity to the wetlands. So this suggests that flooding issues on the farmland and the general area are likely to be exacerbated here. It's our understanding that since the termination of our longstanding lease, another farmer has signed a lease for the use of the land. So we hope that it has been communicated to them that that area is identified as prime farmland and should continue to follow organic pest management protocols as outlined by the state of Massachusetts. We followed these regulations diligently for decades. We also hope that if this proposed development is approved, that this board will enforce strict protocols with the developer and the future HOA so that only strict organic practices are used for lawns, trees, gardens, building materials, etc. And I hope that this board does consider doing a hydrological and hydrogeological study. Was someone going to say anything? Sorry, I thought I heard an interruption. In conclusion, we just actually want to kind of just take a moment and thank the community for the support that they've shown us over this past year. And it's been especially important to my father, who has farmed this land for the past 60 years. And thank you very much. It was a rather stressful and devastating way to kind of end that time. But thank you for allowing us the opportunity to speak.
All right, thank you.
Caitlin Merrill. Getting promoted.
Caitlin. Okay, Caitlin, we have you on the board.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, my Zoom took a minute there to join in. Hello, good evening. My name is Caitlin Merrill. I have been a resident of Hamilton since 2009. Thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts tonight. When my husband and I moved here almost 13 years ago, we looked at homes across the North Shore in many different towns and communities. But what drew us specifically to Hamilton and keeps us here to raise our children is the beautiful landscape and the easy access to the outdoors and conservation areas. The parcel of land being discussed tonight includes beech hemlock forest, a type of forest that's near to my heart, As others have spoken before tonight and on other nights, this is a particular type of mature forest habitat. Beech hemlock forests develop over hundreds of years, and they are increasingly rare in Massachusetts and in the northeastern US and Canada. They are threatened not only by deforestation and development, but also by pests such as the woody adelgid. Hemlocks can live for over 350 years and beeches for a similar length of time. I suspect that there are trees in this parcel that's being discussed tonight that were alive when our country was founded. This beech hemlock forest that I mentioned is a particular type of forest that is my personal favorite. I first learned about them in ecology classes at Colby College in 1999. And since that time, I have specifically sought out beech hemlock forests for hikes and recreational opportunities. They grow in a mature ecosystem where the land has been untouched for generations. The way they develop is naturally over time, and they cannot be replaced or specifically replanted in a formerly deforested area. They are characterized by a diversity of plants, trees, fungi, and vertebrates. Vertebrates such as mammals and birds and migratory animals, as were discussed a few moments ago. Many plants and animals found within them are listed as species of concern by the state and federal government. Additionally, in my research, I've learned that the site being discussed tonight is less than a half a mile from a designated priority habitat for the state of Massachusetts. That's priority habitat 1793. The environments appear to be very similar, and I feel this warrants further review. It is magnificent that we have here in Hamilton such a beautiful, calm, ecologically diverse and rich beech hemlock forest. It is our responsibility to protect this resource. We need to protect it not only for ourselves and our neighbors, but for future generations. I want to say I am not anti-development, and I do support development of additional senior housing in our town, but this development does not seem appropriate for this specific area, nor is it in keeping with the culture and values of the town I choose to call home and choose to raise my family in. If we want Hamilton to remain an economically vibrant community, we need to continue to attract new families. Honestly, open space and access to natural resources are a top selling point for this community. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Promoting Virginia. Panelist.
Okay, Virginia. You're muted, so there you go.
Oh, that.
That's good. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Now you can see me.
Yeah, I can. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Oh, I actually spent a long time trying to write this. I'm not a good writer, so bear with me, please. First of all, for those who don't know me, my name is Virginia Cookson, and I lived at 318 Forest Street for more than 50 years. I'm also a member of the town's Conservation Commission, also for several years. The area of concern I have is totally outside the jurisdiction of the Conservation Commission. So I'm speaking as a resident. I'm also speaking as an individual conservation commissioner, but without any authority to carry with my words, just to let you know I obviously have environmental concerns as top priorities. There are two concerns, areas of concern I have in for the proposed 50 condominium development at 133 Essex Street. First is the hill site for the condominiums where they'll be blasting the top of the hill mostly off, and not totally from, I did go town hall and try to look through the plans. They don't, I only had one afternoon. Anyways, I do notice that there's a wetland on the top of that hill with the buffer zone, which is not going to be touched. It's going to be left alone. So they're not actually taking the whole top off. However, The slopes around the hill, as you know, are quite steep, and much of the slopes at the top will be, the elevation will be cut down lower. And I honestly couldn't find out the numbers as to how high they are and how much is going to be taken off. The hill itself will end up being concave for part of it, and in order to build condos. And I'm trying to say is that just 1 minute. Okay, I'm better off I don't read. Okay. Okay, the second concern okay, the first concern has to do with the rain or precipitation for that site. The rain and snow, of course, come down over everything into the top of that hill, which is mostly stone. So some of the water may soak in and stuff, and of course that wetland keeps some in there too because it's impervious. But the rest of it flows in all directions off the side of the hill down mostly steep slopes, providing water to the surrounding area around the hill. By taking the top of the hill off and actually depressing it, now that same water or the rains and precipitates all year long, and now instead of running off to all the sides, the only stuff running off the side, it will be what hits the remaining slope and continues down. Other than that, it's all going to end up going inside, with the exception, of course, of that wetland that will stay there, the rain, whatever will stay there. But where all the condominiums are going to go in the road and any type of landscape, all the water is going to run to that. I do understand from reading that it has it's planned to have an extensive drainage system underneath the road and stuff. So that rain, most of it will be caught up by that, I assume, and should be by the drainage system, and will be directed to the 4 proposed rain gardens. I didn't get the information as to where all 4 of them are, but so I had to continue with the thought is that you're taking the water that used to come and go in all directions, and now you're taking and you're massively pushing it in one direction, out through the drainage, out to those rain gardens. I don't know if it stays in a rain garden or goes out from the rain garden, whether it's a detention pond or retention ponds, or whether you spread. I don't know anything really about the structure of a rain garden. What concerns me is, of course, that the water no longer goes to the rest of the surrounding area around that hill. A lot of that going to your west goes right over what we used to call the Blue Dot Trail. That's quite close to the base of the slope on the west side of that hill. And then it continues across to some flat land and into the buffer zone and then to a wetland. The same thing also to the northwest. There's another wet area. And of course, there's that vernal pool to the east northeast. It's behind the house. It's near the entrance. Okay. So the water distribution is what concerns me. If you increase it one place and you decrease it someplace else, there's a change to the wetlands. If there's a change to the wetlands, that's not good. And it's not really supposed to be allowed. The other
Virginia, I don't want to cut you off, but we have other people that would like to share their thoughts. So if you could wrap it up.
Okay. The other one is as a result of the decrease in the elevation and the elimination of all the vegetation on top of that hill and some of the slope, it's going to increase the amount of sunshine and warmer air over the land adjacent to it, mostly to the north, but partly also to the northwest and northeast. This in the long run is going to keep more sunshine on it longer like forever, as well as going to change the temperature and the moisture content of that air. And therefore, it's going to reduce the amount of moisture in the ground. And there is a domino effect where you can expect if you reduce the temperature and the moisture in that area, then the next area adjacent to it's going to be affected a little bit less, but it can over time have a domino effect all the way to the wetlands. So my conclusion was that I thought we really needed a study of the current conditions, everything that's there, including how much water goes in what direction, and if possible, even in what budgets feeds. And the other thing is to try to predict how that's going to change following the proposed development. And if it doesn't jive between, if they can't be agreeable, I think that the plan shouldn't work for that piece of the property. Thank you for hearing me.
All right, Virginia, thanks very much.
Promoting John Buono. Sorry if I mispronounced. Oh, you declined. Maybe I'll
Okay.
allow it to talk.
Okay, I think I'm allowed to talk now. Is that
There you
true?
go.
Yep, you're
Okay,
on,
very
John.
good. Okay, this will only be a minute. All right, good evening, lady and gentlemen of the planning board. Thank you for your hard work and your ability to scrutinize these many difficult issues. I'm John Bono, a resident of Tobacco Road, adjacent to Gravelly and Round Pond. I'm a long-time listener and a first-time caller. I'll focus on one of my many concerns. Drilling, blasting, crushing, sieving, and conveying granite produces copious amounts of dust. Granite, unfortunately, in particular, contains 45 to 50% of silica. According to the CDC, this is a severe threat to individuals who have compromised breathing issues, such as asthma or bronchitis, just to mention a few. Any living creatures that have lungs can develop silicosis from fine particulates. Dust from drilling and blasting can stay airborne for 12 days. I'm sure the members of the board will give due diligence to this environmental concerns that will have a permanent negative impact on this very fragile environment. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Pat, you're muted, so.
Yep, just saw it. Promoting Beth to panelist. Thanks.
Hi, I, unlike the last one, am brand new to this whole conversation, so these may be things that have already been covered, but I had a couple questions that came up tonight for me was, I know there was an independent study done, but I didn't know who paid for that. And, you know, obviously who pays the bill can determine, have some level of impact on an independent study. And then the other questions I had was about the water that impacts Essex and Manchester. I didn't know if there's been any consultation with Essex and Manchester, since this could impact their water supply. And I also didn't know if the town could have any liability because of any impact that they might have with Essex and Manchester if there is a problem. So those were just some thoughts that I had. Like I said, I'm new to the conversation, so you may already have answered those in previous conversations.
Well, I can answer one of those is that there's an independent third-party review, which is paid for by the applicant, but the town selects the consultant to do the third-party review. So the applicant does not decide who we hire. They just pay for it.
Great. That's, I appreciate you answering that. Thanks.
On the water, Patrick, are you still with us?
I am still with us.
Patrick,
I have been in contact with the town of Manchester. As a matter of fact, every emailing that I send out includes a member of the Manchester Planning Board. many of the folks on the screen and in attendance tonight will be aware that and have received the copy of the email that we received from the Manchester DPW director saying at that time he had no concerns with the water related matters based on this project. He was looking forward to additional information as part of this project as it advances, but at that time he had no concerns about the project. He felt like it was far enough away that he was not concerned at that point. Again, I will send him more information as the project advances so he can comment from Manchester relative to water quality topics.
And has there been any conversation with Essex? Since those two were the names that came up in the conversation. That's why I was asking.
They're aware of the project, but they haven't made any informational requests of me or the town.
Is that it, Beth?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay. I'd like to see if we can take 2 or 3 more questions and then probably wrap it up because we're getting on there.
There's two raised hands left, and there's a bunch of Q&A. Some are just comments. Oh, now 3 hands.
Okay, let's take those 2 hands and then we can do the Q&A.
Oh, 4 hands. Kathy Rich Duvall, 5 hands. I'm promoting to panelist Kathy Rich Duvall.
Okay. Don't see her popping up.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, and I don't have a video, but that's fine. You don't need to see me unless you have a way to get me on the screen. But I don't see how to, doesn't give me any options here. Anyway, so hi, I'm Kathy Rich Duval. I'm the owner of 133 Essex Street. And I have talked to the board before, and thanks for taking my comments. I'm going to reiterate some things that I have said in previous meetings, but I think that they really need to be reiterated, just like some other people have reiterated same thoughts, because I think it's important. So my family has owned this land for since the mid to late 1950s. It was bought to be developed. But what I really want to talk about tonight is what I keep hearing about from, especially the comments from the public. Tonight, we heard from a teacher, we heard from several residents talking about open space and conservation land, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want to just remind people that this is private land that my family has owned. And continues to own. My brothers and I own it. I want to remind the public that, you know, it is private land. We are very disheartened and disappointed in terms of the destruction, the vandalism, the trespassing on our private property. I've personally put up a mesh fence, Jersey barriers, no trespassing signs. People are illegally cutting down trees. My family members have been verbally attacked on my own private land. And, it's very disheartening. I respect comments, and we all can agree to disagree. My brothers and I support this development. It is not conservation land, it's private land. And so I wish that people would remember that. I think that the public needs to be reminded that we pay full taxes on this land. We have done this since the mid to late 1950s. These are not legal trails. They are pathways that people have made on the property. And so, you know, I'm on 99% of these calls and anything that has to do with this project because I'm very supportive of it. You know, so that's basically what I wanted to remind. There are a lot of people that are new to this that are here, and they don't realize that this is private land. Okay, private land that was bought for the purpose of development, and it will be developed one way or another in some format. And my brothers and I are very supportive of this project because it honors my parents' wishes. And so that's it. And I truly appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Kathy. Why don't we take one more person that would like to speak, and then we got to get to the questions.
Okay. Promoting Steve Gang.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, and I love your picture.
Well, as it happens, I'm a resident of Manchester and chair of the Conservation Commission here, which I've served for about a decade. I'm not here to support or oppose the project in front of you. In fact, I'm here with a lot of respect for the care you're taking to look at a very difficult subject, and gratitude that it's not in front of my board. I've been asked by the Board of Selectmen of Manchester to assemble a task force to look at a strategy for ensuring quality and quantity of drinking water. So in answer to a question raised earlier, we are in the process of collecting information about watershed and hydrological connections, particularly as they affect our gravelly pond, which provides 60 or 70% of our municipal drinking water. There is clearly a lot of work to do, and we would definitely support any effort you make to determine those hydrological connections, both south from the project site toward Beck and Round and Gravelly Ponds, as well as north to your own wells. I think particularly because, according to the Mass DEP water supply protection map, the wellhead protection district, the District 2, comes fairly close to the area proposed for this work, maybe 1,000 feet. That's a rough guess, looking at the map. So we as your neighboring town would greatly appreciate it. And I know Chuck Dam, the head of DPW, would second what I'm saying about our need for additional information. Thanks.
Good. Just suggest that you stay in touch or keep or make information requests to Patrick, because he is the keeper of all the information that's coming from all the parties. I'd like to move to the questions because we've got about 23 questions and answers. And so Patrick, do you want to pop those up, or do you want me to pop them up and read them?
Totally up to you.
Okay, I'll start. A stream runs from Beck Pond along the adjacent property, splits onto mine at 16 Tobacco Road, passes under the road and empties into 133 Essex. At the split, stream then feeds the pond on my property, then drains under Tobacco Road onto farmland at 133 Essex. With the construction of the water main and whatever else is going on, how is the ecosystem going to be protected? That's such a general question. I have no way to answer that. Anybody want to take a shot at it?
So I mean, we can go through and answer these. I think Mr. Frappo was pretty clear that we're not going to have an impact, that we're not going to cause damage. And when the town put the water main in Chabaco, there was no impact, and there's not going to be now. I mean, if you want, we can have Rick talk about it, but it was already discussed.
Okay, we'll move on. My actual experience shows contamination from minerals in the rock disturbed by blasting, such as iron mineral salts, which require water to be filtered at great expense. Well, as I think as was mentioned in several of our meetings, well owners are going to be offered the opportunity to have their wells examined pre-construction and monitored, I believe, continuously on 30-minute intervals, 30 days prior to the blasting, during the blasting, and 30 days afterwards, testing for all these minerals to see if in fact there are any. And if in fact there is any kind of mitigation required, it will be up to the applicant and their insurance companies to take care of and solve any problems created by that blast. Did I get that right, Joe?
The 30-minute stuff is really the wells. There's a device put in to measure
Right.
the levels,
Right.
not to test. The testing is not done every 30 minutes by any stretch.
Oh,
But in
okay.
addition, with regard to the exposure to the wells, not only are we going to guarantee there's not going to be a detrimental impact that will last, but that if there is such an issue, we are responsible, and we're putting in a water line down the street. So it's not as if there is ever going to be, as you know, was alleged, the lack of potable water. That will never happen.
Okay.
So I just want to address that as part of that. Go on.
Yeah.
And Rick, if I could just add one thing,
Oh.
in addition to that, we do have the 8 monitoring wells that will be surrounding the project area. So we'll be monitoring those, every 2 weeks for water quality, for all these salts, for all these metals. And we'll know, immediately if we start exhibiting exceedances of water quality standards. And at that point, we'll stop and figure out what to do to correct the problem, if there is a problem. So we have these sentinel wells in place that would basically prevent, any impacts from going beyond where the project area is.
Okay.
And like I said before, we're not using chemicals that can migrate, from this blast area. Turbidity is really an issue that only exists within, a short distance from the blasting area. So I just want to make that clear as well.
Yeah, and then there's the question, and I think we've answered this, but I'll read it. So what happens if our wells are contaminated in the future? They're monitoring wells to monitor for water quality and minerals, and it will be the responsibility of the applicant to solve any problems that they may create. Let's see, if there will be a total of 107 days of blasting, how many hours for drilling? How many hours per day will drilling and blasting go on? What about the traffic studies about during and after the units are occupied? Are the licensed blast pros considered to be 1099 employees here, no liability insurance? I kind of doubt that one. Let's see, where did this just popping up? Hold on, there we go. Okay. I can't tell you how much drilling is going on. Maybe somebody else can.
So as far as the drilling goes, Andy, by the way, this just to make it clear, I don't know where everybody gets 6 to 8 months of blasting, but it's pretty clear that it's 120 days, which is not 6 or 8 months, but maybe 4. So I just want to make that clear. But with regard to the amount of drilling, Andy, I can't answer that question either, Mr. Mitchell, but I do know that Andy DeFore can.
Yes, the drilling's pretty much concurrent with the blasting, so you could use those days. There might be a few more days. We'll show up on site, we'll drill for a day or 2, and then the blasting will commence, and it'll be drilling and blasting every day.
Okay.
And the hours are just the work hours of the project. I mean, it's pretty typical, whatever whatever the work hours are, the drilling hours, the blastings per the town, whatever was on the permit was 9 to 4. They'll tell us.
Okay. Questions keep popping up here. So it disappeared. Where'd it go? Well, I'll go on. Wouldn't blasting impact the hydrology of the wetland? It sounds like blasting could have an adverse impact on vernal pools. I think we've discussed this in great detail. So I don't think we need to go on. And there's one, Miss Ransom. I don't know. There's no question there. Okay, it appears you were describing potential worst case scenario that could cause irreparable harm in water supply in Hamilton and Manchester. If this worst case scenario comes true, will there be any possible way to fix the aquifer? And if so, the cost of reparations in terms of millions, tens of millions of dollars. Can't help you there. I think, everybody has testified, the geohydrologists and hydrologists and blast people who've got expertise said that's highly unlikely. But I don't know what happens in that case. It would fall back to the applicant to probably come up with remediation, if I'm not incorrect about that, Jill.
It absolutely would be, but we are, I mean, every expert that's testified objectively has basically said there isn't going to be an impact to the aquifer because of the fact that we are literally drilling the top out of the bedrock. So it's an absolutely incendiary argument.
Okay, thank you. Point of clarification is mentioned tonight, there would be 45 truckloads a day with carrying a capacity of 28 cubic yards crushed truck, but carrying capacity of a typical dump truck is 10 to 14 cubic yards. So that would require 90 truckloads a day. Well, no, actually, I know that there are trucks that are bigger than 10 to 14 cubic yards. So
we do intend to use the ones with 28 cubic yard capacity. That's our intent.
Yeah. Other than raising a hand, is there any other way to be asked to be heard this evening? Virginia, we've already talked to you. Second and final question. Tonight's expert mentioned 107 blast days in phases 1 and 2 and 93 hauling days. Given blast regulations Monday through Friday on clear days and Hamilton's yearly average of 201 clear days, would it be reasonable to presume that local residents should expect a minimum of 1 year blasting prep work? I want to take a shot at that.
Sure. No,
Andy?
I mean, we basically said how many days it's going to be, and that's how many days it's going to be. 107 blast days. So is it going to take a year? I mean, unless you have that much intermittent rain, I don't see that. I mean, it's not our intent to do that. Andy? I mean, our intent is to do exactly what we said. So could it take a few days more because you have rain events? Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I mean, I think we just got to watch the weather, but it's pretty hard to speak to because it's an unknown.
But a year would be, 3 to 4 times what we're anticipating. 3 times. That's unheard of.
Okay, would it be more reasonable for the applicant digest this info and allow the public to have our time rather than Miss Mann to occupy more time? She could open the next meeting after digesting this info as opposed to taking up the public time. I'm not going there. We try and be as fair as we can. The applicant is the applicant and is presenting a lot of detailed information in response to the requirements of the zoning bylaw, as well as questions from the public and Save Chabaco Woods, as well as the board. So she gets a lot of time to answer those questions. I'm dismayed the board is not following upon the agreed upon format. Well, we're doing the best we can. This is a really long meeting. It seems unfair to make the board members and others wait so long to provide feedback. This is what we agreed upon. The applicant goes first, the board goes next, and then it was requested that Ms. Eliason and the consultants give their presentation first, and then the public would speak next. It feels like the town is giving more time and support to the developer and more people than more than people in the town. Who do you represent? We represent the town, and we are engaged in a process that we've used many times. The applicant is the one that is proposing this, and they are in the seat of proposing information and delivering that to the board so we can consider it, and also paying for third-party peer reviewers to provide us with independent, objective information, which takes a long time to digest. Okay, destroying our forest for economic gain is akin to burning Renaissance painting to cook a meal, okay? There are many concerned people in Manchester, including the Manchester Concom, who we just heard from, the chair. Please let everyone speak. It is important. I'm requesting as a Hamilton resident, the next meeting, we actually get equal time to the developer. We've already answered that question. Can we please let Dave Lash from Chaco Lake and Watershed Association comment? His hand was raised. We haven't heard from him. Has the planning board considered this parcel represents the last remaining acres to an act connected to the Manchester watershed? Hamilton depends the water from the Ipswich River includes the Ipswich River. It's not likely to be a sustainable plan for the future. The Ipswich River represents the 8th most major river in the U.S. and seems like a significant risk to the town. Water is certainly something we have been discussing in great detail. Developer has not covered how the runoff from building chemical stains, fertilizer after for years will affect our water supply. Well, that's going to be in a water, what's that? The term I need. The runoff, what's the plan?
Stormwater plan that's been reviewed by TEC.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yes, stormwater plan is being reviewed by the state. So, the town is required to comply, as well as the applicant, with all state and local bylaws controlling the quality of water. David Lash, I asked to speak, was not called up on Chaco Lake Watershed Association urged planning board to mandate a thorough hydrology and hydrogeology study. As Tom Nelson stated, we're dealing with one communicating system with bodies surface below grade and extends well beyond the impact of most development projects. I will send a letter with more details on our concern for the downstream effects of this development on runoff water quality. Thank you for your careful review. It's proposal, David. Mr. Mitchell, when you read the questions, you keep fading in and out. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. It could be my brain. Dave Lash is here. His hand was raised. Could you clarify the length of blasting? There are 107 blasting days, but you can only do 5 days a week. That would be 21.4 weeks without weather delays for 6 months.
That's true, but we don't blast on the weekend, so it's not time used.
Okay. I think we're done with the questions. We're now at 10:38. We've been at this for 2.5 hours. Does anybody have any other comments they would like to make or questions for the applicant or anybody else in attendance? Okay, so I would like to make somebody make a motion to continue the hearing on 133 Essex special permit to the next planning board meeting, which, Patrick, are you still here? What date is that?
That will be on February the 8th.
Okay, so I'd like to make a motion to continue the hearing, special permit hearing on 133 Essex to February 8th. Somebody make that motion.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we continue the hearing on 133 Essex.
Okay, we'll do
February 8th.
I second that motion, but in conjunction with my second, I would request that the Ransom Engineering PowerPoint be distributed to planning board members.
Okay. So we have his motion has been made. This second, We'll do a roll call vote. Emil,
Emil Dahlquist, aye.
Bill,
Bill Wheaton, aye.
Jonathan,
Jonathan Poor, aye.
Richard Boroff,
Richard Boroff, aye.
Corey,
Corey Beaulieu, aye.
Rick Mitchell, aye. Okay, so the special
You
permit.
forgot
hearing-
me.
I forgot Marnie.
Oh, Marnie, I'm sorry. I thought when you seconded Mike. Sorry, me. Marnie,
Marty Crouch, aye.
thank you. All right, so the special permit hearing is continued until February 8th. All
Thank you
right.
very much for your time.
All right, thank you, everybody, for your time and your comments. Patrick, is there any pressing matters that we need to address right now before we all retire?
The most important one, I think, is to have the board vote to authorize the chair to sign the site plan approval that the board agreed to at our last meeting. I've written that up. Marnie has given me the benefit of editing and cleaning up my text and language and punctuation. I've sent that document to board members, so I'm respectfully requesting that the board authorize its chairman to sign the site plan approval for the Iron Ox Farm greenhouse project.
I make that motion, Mr. Chairman, that we authorize the chairman to sign the approval for the Iron Ox project.
I second that motion.
Okay, any discussion?
Just one question, Rick. Was there public input on that particular project? Do you recall? I don't recall at the last meeting.
None that came in.
Yeah, there were no
Okay.
members of the public in attendance. There were no public comments relative to that project, Emil.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, roll call vote. Bill Wheaton,
Aye.
Corey,
Corey Beaulieu, aye.
Emil,
Emil Dahlquist, aye.
Jonathan,
Jonathan Poor, aye.
Marnie,
Marty Crouch, aye.
Richard,
Richard Boroff, aye.
Rick Mitchell. Well, I guess I authorized myself. All right, so it's unanimous. Okay, anything else, Patrick?
Let's see, we do have meeting minutes from January the 4th.
Okay. Does anybody have comments, additions, deletions, or edits?
May I make a comment?
Well, we're really involved in board meeting minutes right now, so unless it's a critical comment.
Just what is that iron, whatever project about that you all agreed to let you sign?
Well, this is typical board business, so.
Oh, I thought it was an application. If not, forget it.
No, it's, we've already had a public hearing on this and the board has voted unanimously to support the project. This is just an administrative, to give me the authority to sign and the final approval.
I understand that. I mean, what was that project about? It sounded interesting with the name, that's all. But-
Yeah. Anyway, so let me finish this process. So we have, I think we've got a motion and a second. So I think we were going through the voting process. Let me start again. Emil, you said aye, right?
I said aye, in recommending the motion, the January 4 minutes be approved.
Yes.
I actually had some edits to those minutes.
Oh, okay.
So they haven't been circulated though. So did anyone else have any comments or edits to the minutes?
I had some concerns, but I think you'll catch them when you edit it. So
So I
I'd say
guess
go
we'll do,
for it.
so I think we'll delay this and because we haven't seen it, right?
Right, and if anybody had any other further edits, if they just forward them to me, I can incorporate whatever comments anyone would have, and then we can consider them at the next meeting on
Okay.
February 8th.
Then, Mr. Chairman, I make a motion, we adjourn.
Actually,
Second.
I have one more piece of business I'd like to talk about before we adjourn, which is in the past, we agreed that before each meeting, each subsequent meeting, the board would discuss and agree upon what the focus and agenda was. And I would like to try to get into that habit, even if we have to end a little sooner to be able to do it. I think it's important.
I think the chair sets the agenda.
Actually,
So
that's
would you like to, what is it that you would like specifically, Jonathan?
I think it would be just from my own personal point of view, but I don't want to speak for the board. From my own personal point of view, I think that there are some areas around or areas of discussion around the septic that we need to make sure we leave time to talk about, not the septic design approval per Board of Health, but the septic's relationship to the rest of the proposal. And I think it would be worth setting aside some time to talk about that. Today's meeting was really about blasting and hydrology and hydrogeology. I want to make sure that if there's any due diligence, if there's any additional information, that we give the applicant adequate time to do it and that it doesn't come at the very end. So I would like to make sure that subject comes up sooner rather than later. It doesn't need to be next meeting, but that would be the only thing that I would bring up right now. But I would really open it to other board members. The idea was to make sure that we feel like the board feels comfortable with how the agendas are being prioritized and structured. That was what we had agreed upon in our previous minutes.
Jonathan, I don't know where you're coming from, but I don't remember any discussion like that. Not what you're talking about. The
Yes,
chair sets
that was agreed to by the committee. But the other issue, I wonder if we could continue the discussion tonight by getting into stormwater. I don't know if the applicant has any presentations for that or any.
No, we're not getting into that discussion. That's not on the agenda and we're late into
We're talking about what the agenda is.
Oh, okay. All right. I thought you wanted to start talking about that.
No, I don't. No, not at this time of day. No. Even I don't want to start doing that.
There was panic in his voice.
No.
I think those two subjects, basically septic and stormwater, big picture would be useful to get on the agenda sooner rather than later. There would be my input and open to other board discussion.
Well, stormwater certainly because it's integral to this project. Septic, I'm not so receptive to that because that's outside the metes and bounds of our authority, and we have no authority under our bylaw to even discuss it. And the applicant has no responsibility to provide that information to us. So I don't know what basis you would have a factual discussion on.
The basis would be basically how it ties back into stormwater management and hydrology and hydrogeology.
No. We're going way off topic here. It's not related to anything in our bylaw, and it really is a tangential and to the entire project. We're not studying the hydrology of the septic system. It has to meet Title V. I did actually, just for your edification, and then we can cut this short and go with the motion. I went down to the Board of Assessors, and I got a GIS map, and I mapped 1,000-foot radius from the center of the property. And there are over 300 properties within 1,000-foot radius, single family homes of all the ponds, Tobacco, Gravelly, Beckett, with at least 2-bedroom systems that are dumping. They have 110 gallons a day requirement or maximum that they can be discharging. You multiply that times 2 bedrooms times 110 gallons, there's 52,000 gallons of raw sewage going into the groundwater, abutting and within 1,000 feet of that property. So they're talking about 7,500 gallons a day, 1,000 feet from that problem, from those ponds. I just don't see any benefit to having that discussion because it's not within our purview.
Here's my proposal then. Here's my proposal that we schedule some time for the board to have an agenda to either agree or disagree or get some expert advice on whether that's true or not. That would be my proposal that I put on the table right now.
I think
Again,
it's pretty clear, Rick.
It's
part of the
outside
Board of
our,
Health.
it's outside our purview. We have no authority to do that.
It's the Board of Health's problem. They deal with the septic. We don't deal with it, period.
We've got so much to deal with. Adding a tangential we have no role in that. And to have this discussion, we're not going to come to any conclusion on this. I can guarantee you. We might get lots of information, but at the end, we can't make a decision based on the septic system hydrology. It's not our authority. And we've got to stop trying to get scope creep into this project. We got to try and narrow it to what we're doing, not expand it.
Mr. Chair, can I make a suggestion that
Please.
in addition with stormwater management and that special permit, that we also review the traffic report as part of the project? Because we haven't even scratched that surface.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. We've got stormwater and we've got traffic to go. So why would we look at the hydrology of the septic system? We're not going to get a peer review. We're not going to hire expertise. We've got nobody testifying on it. It's going to be purely a theoretical discussion that's going to get us nowhere.
And we have no theory on it. We're not experts in that area. It's not our purview. I mean, it's just.
So stormwater, absolutely. That's the position I'm taking. We can talk about this at our next meeting, but I'd like to move on.
Okay, I make a motion to adjourn.
Okay.
Second.
Okay, we have a second. So let's do a roll. Well, never mind a roll call. How about raised hands? Do we have a unanimous decision to adjourn?
My hand is up.
Okay, we have a unanimous decision to adjourn. Thank you, everybody. See you on February 8th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.